I got loyalty, got royalty inside my DNA. I got love, peace, got war and peace inside my DNA. I got power, poison, pain, and joy inside my DNA.
Kamado Nezuko was an average girl born from a normal family. Her father had passed away due to illness, and her older brother had taken the mantle of helping their mother support their little family. She didn't have her brother's patience and strength. The whole family depended on him because Tanjiro had always been the most reliable. However, what she shared in common with him was his determination, his ability to adapt to the situation, and his empathy. Sometimes, she felt guilty about letting him take on all these responsibilities and decided to help where she could. Still, her brother never complained, just shouldered all of it with a smile. She wondered how her brother always did it. Nezuko knew that Tanjiro possessed the same sharp instincts as their late father. Tanjiro had tried to explain it, as simple as her brother could while gesturing wildly, how his sense of smell gave him a different perspective of the world around them. Their father had once remarked that it was one of the reasons why Tanjiro was so in tune with his empathy. What she lacked in enhanced senses, she made up for her intuition. She knew when the weather's going to turn for the worse, when someone was trying to take advantage of her older brother's kindness, when Hanako would try to sneak out at night to read, when Takeo would try to hide any injuries from her in order to appear as strong as their older brother, or even just when Rokuta would start fussing about the cold. On the day when their father died, she had that uneasy feeling with her that she couldn't shake off and had stayed with her until his last moments. Therefore, upon seeing her brother intending to leave to sell some charcoal for New Year's feast, she'd already set and putting their youngest sibling to sleep. She approached him and conveyed her farewell when she felt it. It started as a cold pit in her stomach followed by a sick feeling of wrongness that she couldn't seem to shake off. Her eyes darted wildly, trying to decipher where it had come from, but it was the first time that her intuition failed her because it felt as if it was everywhere. Watching her older brother trekking down the mountain, Nezuko found herself running after him. "Onii-chan," she called out for him, needing to make sure. The fear in her chest wouldn't leave, and she wanted Tanjiro, who was going out there on his own, alone, to stay safe because this feeling would not go away. Her older brother stared at her over his shoulder, brows furrowing and seeming to have sensed her distress. "Nezuko?" His voice sounded concerned. "Is something wrong?" Nezuko knew that she shouldn't be afraid about telling him anything as Tanjiro wholeheartedly believed in her sixth sense as he called it. But she also didn't want to worry him. He already worried enough for all of them. So she forced a smile on her lips. "Please make sure that you come back tonight," Nezuko compromised and ignored the plea in her words, awaiting his response with bated breath. She needed to be certain. Some of her fears were laid to rest when Tanjiro gave her that familiar smile of understanding followed by a determined nod. Nezuko wondered what would have happened if she had kept that feeling to herself. Rokuta, Nezuko called for her youngest sibling, hand trying to reach out for the boy's dead body. The pain on her head and shoulder, from when that monster had thrown her through the door, was nothing compared to the agony of watching the rest of her family get slaughtered. Her sight became blurred with tears, feeling an overwhelming anger at her own helplessness in this situation. She'd had that horrible, horrible feeling when she'd seen that man trespassing on their land, cat-like eyes the same color as plum glaring at her from across the snowy ground. She understood that this was no human. "Someone, please," Nezuko prayed, not for her life, but for someone to slay this monster before any more lives were lost. However, she heard something that made her blood run cold. "Nezuko," the alarmed voice of her brother echoed inside their eerily quiet home, which was now devoid of life, and she shakily shifted her head as her shocked eyes met the wide, horrified ones of her older brother. The same older brother that she'd begged to come back home tonight. No, please, not him too. "What do we have here?" The man, who'd stayed silent the whole time he'd ended the lives of her family, spoke in a chilling voice that made Nezuko freeze on the floor. The resemblance is absolutely revolting. To think that the legacy of that human continues to live on, he mused almost contemplatively, if not for the sheer anger lacing his tone. Who are you? She heard her older brother demand, heard the pain in his tone. Why are you doing this, to us? What was astonishing, perhaps, was the utter lack of fear. It seemed that the man had sensed it too because, in a blink of an eye which she hadn't seen him move, the monster had his clawed hand wrapped around Tanjiro's neck as he lifted her older brother up with disturbing ease, strangling him. Nezuko tried to move, wanting to save the last of her family, but found that her limbs were completely frozen in fear. The sudden pressure that permeated the air was overpowering and tears of frustration leaked from her eyes at her uselessness. The man leaned in and whispered something in her brother's ear, and she could only watch as despair clouded his face. Nezuko wished that she had her brother's strength, that she had his courage. She considered how Tanjiro viewed this situation. If the smell of blood was already intense for her, it must be 1,000 times worse for her older brother, who probably smelled the stench of death even before he reached their house. What did we ever do to you? She couldn't help but wonder in a fit of rage at the total unfairness of the situation. Feeling adrenaline coursing through her powered by her anger, she lifted her body off the ground and grabbed the nearest weapon, which was one of her mother's kitchen knives, with a death grip. Willing her body to move, to save her dear brother, she ran towards the monster who had his back turned away from her. She was going to kill this scum. Let go of Onii-chan, leave him alone, she heard herself shout in fury. Tanjiro's distressed gaze met hers. His lips moved frantically in a warning as he flailed wildly in the man's grasp. Run, he told her repeatedly. No, how could he even think to ask that from her, to leave him? Just as she was about to stab the source of her misery, her eyes widened when she met those demonic eyes. She thought that she heard her older brother yell something, but it was as if the world slowed down as one of those clawed hands reached for her face. Her world turned black and she knew no more. When she came to, she was enveloped in a warm cocoon that was in contrast with the cold weather, feeling some of the snowflakes touch her cheek. Her eyes opened to see the lower face of Tanjiro with herself carefully tucked in his arms and covered in a blanket. For a moment, she was in a state of disbelief and wanted to imagine that it was all a bad dream. But her intuition screamed of grief, and the persisting pain on her shoulder drove that reality home. Grasping at her only ray of hope, she clutched on her brother's checkered haori and cried. The crunching of snow halted with her brother's footsteps, and Nezuko continued to cry her heart out. She didn't know what happened after, but she was so glad that her brother survived. Nezuko wouldn't know what to do with herself if he had died too because of her selfishness. It was at that time that Tanjiro tilted his head to properly look down at her. She blinked her eyes in order to clear it from her tears and stared. Nezuko had spent all her years growing up beside her brother and knew his features by heart like the back of her hand. His burgundy eyes still reflected that same gentleness he was known for, but they were slitted, like a cat's like that monster's, and when he tried to give her a reassuring smile, she saw the fangs peeking out from underneath and black smudges at the corner of his lips. Onii-chan, she called out faintly. Something was wrong. Her intuition blared as dread began filling her. First of all, how did she survive? All she remembered was trying to attack that man before everything went dark, practically leaving her brother in that monster's mercy. She was going to get killed. She knew it, understood that, so how? Instead of answering her, Tanjiro gave her a soft smile, eyes curving into crescents. Nezuko watched as those burgundy orbs lightened under the dim light. His hair was out of its usual ponytail, cascading down his shoulders in soft waves. Before she could properly ponder about what all of it meant, she felt her brother tense as the snow wafted around them, his hold on her momentarily tightening as his gaze flitted to the front. Following his gaze, she saw a dark-haired teen standing rigidly across from them with his icy blue eyes fixated on her brother. It wasn't until her red eyes landed on his hand gripping the hilt of his sword tightly that she understood what he must have been intending. No, don't attack Onii-chan. Nezuko struggled in her brother's arms, ready to defend his innocence. Are you aware of what he'd become? The other merely retorted, eyes not shifting even for a second. My job is to slay demons. Needless to say, your brother has become one of them. He said tonelessly as he pulled out his sword from its sheath, motion fluid and ready. Please don't kill him. It wasn't him. My brother would never hurt anyone. She yelled desperately as she clutched onto her brother's Haori, frantic to find a reason for all of this. There was a man back at our house. He killed everyone, and I don't know what he did to Onii-chan. Her throat constricted at the memories of dead bodies, of never seeing her mother's smile and her younger siblings' cheerful faces because she was so helpless. That's simple. His wounds were exposed to demon blood. The teen countered calmly. Nezuko bit her lip as she stilled, absently noting her brother's torn, bloodied sleeve. It was hard to be surprised, especially with her intuition warning her that this entire situation was wrong. But damn it, this was her older brother, Tanjiro. He was the last of her family, no matter what he'd become. She blinked in surprise when her brother trudged towards the swordsman. What? Nezuko was stupefied. No, Onii-chan, we have to run. He's going to. Tanjiro stopped directly in front of the swordsman. She could tell that even he was baffled at her older brother's action when he'd made his purpose clear. At least, he wasn't outright attacking because Nezuko would not falter this time. Her eyes widened when her brother gently laid her on the ground, absently wrapping the blanket around her shoulders more securely before straightening to face the other. She watched as her brother gently tapped the other's blade with a finger. What was he? The burgundy-haired youth then pointed that same finger to his neck, sliding it across his throat. You want me to kill you? Was the choked-out whisper, wide-eyed as if the older teen hardly believed what he was seeing. Nezuko felt her intuition screaming as Tanjiro merely smiled and nodded. How dare he? How dare he? No! She screamed as she scrambled to her feet and tackled her brother on the snow, uncaring of their audience. You can't leave me too. Onii-chan, you can't leave me alone. I don't want to lose you too. She felt herself sobbing as she clenched her hands into fists and repeatedly smacked him on the chest. Just when she'd been thinking that she at least had someone with her, Tanjiro was going to leave her in this world too. She paused in her crying as she felt a gentle hand rubbing her head. Will, he spoke in a rasp as he smiled at her. Be okay, be fine. Tanjiro spoke slowly as if he was testing the words out. Onii-chan, what happened to you? She whispered miserably, distraught at the thought that that monster had sunk his hands into her brother. Tanjiro blinked at her inquiry and tilted his head. Seeing those cat-like eyes peering at her from her brother's burgundy orbs unnerved her. He felt like her brother, but at the same time, he felt like it wasn't wholly him either. Whatever that monster had done to him, it felt like the older boy had lost something from it. She couldn't help the smile that blossomed on her lips when her brother continued to rub her head, seeming to enjoy himself. Our mother and younger siblings are dead, she sniffled and glared at the older teen furiously, but not to blame him for that monster's deed. And you're trying to take Onii-chan away from me too. Don't take anyone else from me. Her voice broke at the end, tears blurring her sight as she wrapped her arms around her brother, afraid that she would really lose him. Nezuko yelped in alarm when she was roughly pulled away from him. Don't turn your back so easily. The dark-haired swordsman gripped her arm firmly and yelled angrily. If I was as decisive a while ago, I could have just stabbed you both and be done with it. And stop that pathetic crying. If it was any helpful, then no one would have had to die or turn into a demon. You begged for your brother's life when he made the choice to surrender it. What made you decide that it wasn't the better option? Nezuko barely had any time to think before she found herself intending to slap the older teen's face. Her wrist was caught easily, but she didn't stop there and used the momentum of his hold to slam her forehead on his chin, hearing a slight creak as it connected solidly, totally blindsiding him as he released her. It was a move that Tanjiro had taught her if anyone in town ever gave her a hard time. She might not have her brother's hard head, but she was more stubborn than him. Her intuition made it clear that she was no match for this person, but didn't blare in warning about danger against him. "Don't you think I know that?" she screamed in frustration. "I was there. I watched helplessly as that monster killed everyone. I couldn't do anything when he went for Onii-chan. I know that. I know. But Onii-chan's all I have now. He wouldn't hurt anyone. You'll have to kill me first to get to him." Nezuko stood her ground as she spread her arms, shielding her brother from this demon slayer. A hand around her elbow made her pause, bringing her brother's long fingernails to her attention. Her brother shook his head at her as if to tell her that it was enough. Her intuition suddenly screeched at her, but she'd been too slow to react as she felt a sharp pain on her neck. For the second time in that long night, her world suddenly turned dark once more. She jolted awake with her family's voice a distant echo in her ears. Her eyes widened upon meeting a familiar burgundy shade similar to her own as Tanjiro absently combed a hand through her hair. Her head was lying on his lap, and her older brother seemed to be biting on a bamboo that acted like some sort of muzzle tied around his head by cloth, hiding his fangs from view. Her body was a bit sluggish with aching fatigue as Nezuko shot up into a sitting position as soon as she recalled the recent events, her gaze snapping to the same swordsman from earlier. "You," she growled heatedly as she understood what happened. This guy had knocked her out, but Nezuko's head snapped to her brother once again, who stared between her and the swordsman in worry, his claw-like hands flailing uselessly in front of him. It was a familiar sight when Takeo and Shidru would get into a fight about something silly, and they decided to pester their older brother whose side he would take on. What had happened during the time that she was unconscious? She kept missing out on things. Still, her brother was alive, and that was all that mattered right now. "He likes you," she grudgingly informed the yet-to-be-named swordsman, still irked at him. "Your brother sensed that I didn't intend to harm you," was the calm reply. It had been quite odd to see him lose his cool earlier now that she thought about it. "To be perfectly honest, he is a lot more patient than you," the older teen declared with flat eyes. Nezuko felt her cheeks warm in embarrassment. "Onii-chan has always been that way." Her lips quirked into a fond smile as she took in the messy burgundy strands, giving her brother a rugged animalistic look. Maybe she should invest some time in cutting it for him. Tanjiro's eyes curved into a happy smile, and it made Nezuko tear up again. "Look for an old man named Yorikadaki Sakunji who lives at the foot of Mount Sajiri." The dark-haired teen pushed off from the tree that he'd been leaning on. "And tell him that Tomioka Jiu sent you. As I told your brother earlier, he'll be fine for now since it's cloudy. Just don't let him get exposed to sunlight." The teen, Tomioka, shifted on his feet, and her intuition already warned her so. "Wait," Nezuko yelled after him, making the other freeze in his tracks. "I'll get stronger and I'll look for that demon who murdered our family. Just you wait." She bit her tongue, halting the thanks she had wanted to give as she felt that her determination was the better response. Tomioka stared at her steadily, making her squirm. "That headbutt hurt a lot," he merely said before he was gone, silent as if he'd never been there. Tears poured down Nezuko's cheeks, and she let herself be pulled into her brother's arms. "I'll get stronger, Onii-chan," she vowed to herself. "And I'm going to kill that demon with my own strength." If she had been looking at Tanjiro, she would have seen the saddened gleam of his eyes, having smelled the bitter ash of revenge in her emotions. Nezuko, despite all the things she'd proclaimed earlier, was at a total loss on how to proceed. Ever since she could remember, she always had her parents and older brother to lean on when things got harder. Even when she gained younger siblings, the role of an older sister didn't stop her from still turning to Tanjiro or her mother about certain things, trusting that they would be there to teach her until she could stand on her own and know what to do. To their whole family, their eldest brother had always been a source of strength. So it was a strange feeling knowing that her older brother would now be depending on her. Despite the pressure of that sole responsibility, Nezuko would shoulder it wholeheartedly. Because she knew that if they were to trade places, her older brother would go to great lengths to take care of her well-being despite what she'd become. That he would love her just the same because that's what their whole family had been about, and that's just the kind of brother he was. Even now, as they resided inside a tiny cave to hide from the sun, Tanjiro had readily patted his lap so she could lie her head on it and get some rest. She wasn't as active as he was even when they were younger. While she helped around the house, it was always her brother who did the heavy workload. It had already been taxing enough lifting the dead bodies of her mother and siblings so they could give them a proper burial even with his help. After getting some change of clothes, she and Tanjiro had to trek down the mountain and through the town quicker in order to cover more ground before the sun came up. Tanjiro had even offered to carry her on his back, but considering what Nezuko had in mind, she knew that she had to start carrying her own weight. Even now, she was tired, yes, but Nezuko knew that she could go on after some rest. The problem was that her brother couldn't travel with her, and she knew no other means to transport him without being subjected to sunlight. She'd thought of just covering him up with the blanket she'd been thoughtful enough to carry with them, but figured that it could garner some attention and might even call on the notice of some demon slayers lurking somewhere. "And it's not like I can just carry you," Nezuko sighed as she absent-mindedly trimmed her brother's hair with some clippers she'd remembered to find before permanently leaving their home. "You're not exactly light like Rokuta, whom I could just carry on my back. So we'll have to wait for sundown before we travel again." She tried not to think too hard about their youngest sibling, especially when his cries still echoed in her ears. Tanjiro tilted his head at that as his eyes lit up. Before then, he stood up with his hands on his hips, and he had that triumphant expression on his face when he'd thought up of something incredible to himself, but was just really a crazy idea to everyone around him. "Listen to this," he would then always say, and Nezuko would just patiently indulge him, even as their younger siblings were torn between awe and disbelief. Even so, more often than not, those ideas ended up working somewhat. Her older brother excitedly covered her eyes with his hands, indicating that he wanted it to be a surprise. So Nezuko waited with bated breath, wondering if this was as crazy as his other schemes, or this just might be the answer to their current predicament. After only hearing continuous rustling, she grew impatient, and the longer she was left waiting, she grew even more anxious about it. "Oni-chan, what are you—" She tried to grab the hand that was still covering her eyes, but stilled as her hand enclosed around a tiny wrist. Slowly opening her eyes, she was met by a tiny being that could only be the younger version of her older brother. In fact, aside from the absence of the mole from under his eye and different hair color, Tanjiro could almost pass as a perfect copy of their late brother Takeo when he'd been that age. Against her will, her eyes teared up at this image and couldn't help but giggle quietly when her brother fussed upon the sight of her tears. "Since when can you do this?" she asked him, voice just the slightest bit watery. His shoulders hunched, making half of his checkered haori fall off of him, before he straightened with an intense look and started gesturing wildly as he stood within the pools of his now too large clothes. Used to his antics, Nezuko could pretty much sum up what he'd been trying to say. It was a talent that she and her mother shared when it came to understanding Tanjiro. Her brother couldn't really explain things simply without adding in unnecessary sound effects and grandiose gestures. Their younger siblings treated it as a game of charade, and Hanako, especially, enjoyed trying to guess what their older brother had been babbling about. "You turned bigger back at our house?" Nezuko elaborated as Tanjiro nodded his head vigorously. "And you drove that monster away with it. So you're basically telling me that you can change your size." She bit her lip at this. This sounded like one of Tanjiro's crazy stories that he used to entertain the others with. But that monster was still out there. Her older brother had confirmed it. So why were they still alive? shaking her head to get rid of darker thoughts. Nezuko stared at her brother contemplatively before smiling. Of course, when she felt like it was the end, her brother would come up with something and save her the trouble. Like he always did. Let's get going, Oni-chan. She had foregone wearing her star-patterned kimono dress and instead used it as a makeshift haori over her new attire, which consisted of a dark kimono top when working around the house and some pants. She never minded if they couldn't afford everything, even if she had to sew her dresses again and again, as long as she could make her sure that their younger siblings were getting what they needed. It was enough. It was something that always bothered her brother, that he couldn't give his siblings what they wanted. And it greatly upset Nezuko every time that Tanjiro used to always apologize for everything. Because she knew that despite doing their best, they couldn't do anything about those things, as everything wouldn't simply go how they wanted. It was just how human beings lived. Still, even if she knew in her being that it would be their decision to be happy in the end, there were limits to what she could accept of what she was dealt with. The death of her family and her helplessness that came with it was something she was having a hard time dealing with. It was unforgivable. Nezuko wasn't even sure if her heart would be able to rest as long as that monster was still alive. She held that thought as she carried Tanjiro through fields and dusty roads in a makeshift sling around her back. She had to stop at a nearby hut and ask for some empty sacks of rice, as her older brother, through lots of squirming, made his discomfort quite clear, as he still felt the sunlight indirectly through the fabric. So she doubled his covering. By sundown, she was already making headway up the mountain despite the protests of some people earlier, claiming that a lot of people were disappearing in the area recently. Nezuko was proud of herself, to be honest. Despite the ache of her feet and shortness of breath, she had been able to go this far. She beamed when she saw that they had reached a temple just as night started to settle in. Maybe they could ask if they could stay for a few hours. Though, she paused as she stared at it a little bit closely, her intuition warning her that there was something amiss. Her older brother suddenly started wriggling, and she had to untie the blanket around her in order to let him down. She blinked in astonishment as Tanjiro immediately went back to his normal height, depositing several sacks on the ground as he fixed his clothing, growling low in his throat as his eyes reflected worry. "Oni-chan, what do you smell?" Nezuko asked in trepidation, hand going to the handle of the axe tied around her waist. Her older brother just shook his head sharply before making a run for it to the temple. "Hey, wait for me," she yelled after him, running as well. Though, the closer she got, the heavier the feeling had gotten, as she could now identify the familiar scent of blood. It made her inside squirm. Seeing her brother frozen by the doorway, Nezuko looked past his shoulder with horrified eyes. Lots of dead bodies of different people greeted them, and the worst thing was the demon munching an arm of one of those people. A red haze started to fill her vision as she recalled the massacre of her own family. "What the hell do you want?" the demon asked roughly, blood dripping from his chin. "This is my territory, so get lost," he growled out loud as he stood up, eyeing the both of them oddly. "Are you both humans?" He seemed skeptical at this as he shifted on his feet. Before Nezuko could react, the demon slammed into her brother, shoving them outside. "He's fast," she thought with narrowed eyes as she immediately ran after them, pulling out the axe from her waist. The dark-haired girl watched as her brother freed himself by scratching the demon's face with his nails before pushing him off. "One of you was a demon after all, I knew it," the man declared as he rubbed at the scratches that healed before their very eyes before jumping on Tanjiro once again. "You kin traitor, what the hell are you doing with a human?" he demanded as he tried to strangle her older brother while said boy held him off, eyes narrowed into slits. "I will not fail this time," Nezuko decided furiously as she chased after them, swinging the axe over her shoulder, wincing at the sudden heavy weight before swinging it towards the demon's neck. She was careful to swing it upwards lest she accidentally injure her older brother if she swung it downwards. It didn't cut all the way through, so she used her foot and kicked its head with as much power as she could. Its head fell to the side a bit, but it didn't detach, and Nezuko ignored her brother's wide-eyed shock as she approached the head, intending to kick it for a second time. Though, Tanjiro tackled her out of the way as he shielded her from a powerful kick from the demon's body, which was still apparently alive. Her older brother grunted as he immediately stood up, running towards the demon, and delivered the second kick that finally separated the head from its body. Nezuko breathed heavily, the red haze from her vision abating just a little. She numbly wondered about her capacity to hurt someone. It worried her that there was no ounce of hesitation as she swung that axe with the intent to kill. But she had been so full of rage the moment her eyes landed on that carnage. These demons irrationally took lives and caused pain without regretting it, and that kind of violence was something she would never ever accept. It reminded her deeply of that monster. "What did we ever do to you?" she remembered thinking back then. Nezuko screamed in surprise when the headless body tried to tackle her, only for her older brother to kick it away. She straightened up and ran towards the grumbling, still alive head, intending to kill it for good. However, she was not prepared for that same head to grow some arms and fight back. "Why won't you just die already?" she snarled in frustration. "Like some puny girl like you could kill me." The demon head scoffed at her derisively. Just to prove him wrong, Nezuko used the move she'd utilized against Tomioka and slammed her forehead on the demon to get him to release her. As soon as he did, she swung her axe once again with a shout. It didn't matter if he caught the blade with his teeth. She continued to swing until she'd slammed him towards the tree, breaking his jaw and embedding the blade through the bark which held him in place. The muffled shouts greeted her, but Nezuko could barely hear it through the noise of her heartbeat ringing in her ears. After the adrenaline wore off, she felt her arms aching, still too unused at the strenuous movements as she collapsed on her knees. "Wait, Onii-chan," she jolted as she recalled that her brother was still fighting before she felt a warm hand on her shoulder. Tanjiro was gazing at her worriedly, his slitted burgundy eyes quivering. The demon's body was nowhere to be seen, and the head was still squirming by the tree. "Are you all right?" Nezuko fussed over him, gingerly touching the drying blood on his shoulder. Her older brother nodded his head, but he was staring at her intently, as if he was trying to decipher her. It was odd. She'd never seen him look at her like that before. Even when he turned to a demon, he hadn't looked at Nezuko as if he didn't know her. It honestly unnerved her. The moment he blinked, it was gone, and he reached out his arms for her and hugged her tightly. She hugged him back just as hard. "Don't worry, Onii-chan," she whispered to him to alleviate whatever it was that bothered him. They both jumped when a hand settled itself on Tanjiro's shoulder, and their heads snapped to a man wearing a Tengu mask standing behind them. Nezuko hadn't felt his approach. It was eerie, but considering that her brother didn't react negatively towards him, then that meant that he wasn't a demon. Nezuko wasn't sure if she was capable of fighting another one, or if her brother would be able to so soon. "You still have a job to do," a deep, aged voice sounded as the man pointed towards the squirming demon head that Nezuko had stabbed to the tree. "That thing still refuses to die," Nezuko growled, ignoring the way her brother stiffened beside her. "What do you want us to do?" She was being rude, she was aware, but she was at the limit of her patience right now. "Can't you use your own head to figure that out?" The man merely retorted, not even bothering to reprimand her. If stabbing's no good, Nezuko contemplated as she eyed the nearby rocks. "Maybe I can just crush his skull." She shakily stood on her feet and approached the rocks, resolve starting to fuel her actions, giving her strength. She grunted at the weight of the rock, almost dropping it on her foot, before trudging towards the demon who was glaring and spitting at her. She had been able to do it a while ago. This time, she just needed to smash his head completely and be done with it. Yet, her hands shook the longer she stared at this creature. She tried to recall the feeling of her anger when that monster had mercilessly decimated her family. "Why won't you just die?" she screamed angrily as she swung down the rock hard, crushing his face, before trying to slam it again only for a hand to enclose her wrist. Her eyes snapped towards a wide-eyed Tanjiro, his slitted burgundy eyes reflecting sadness. Why? Don't you understand? They did this to us. Her hands trembled again as she dropped her makeshift weapon, tears welling up in her eyes. Why was it so hard? Nezuko clasped her hands in prayer for all the people that had died by that monster's hands. The moment the sun had come up, Tanjiro had disappeared inside the temple, while the demon they had tried so hard to kill burned and disintegrated under the sunlight. Why didn't her brother understand? Did he empathize with the demons too? Was this something he would have done, or because he was a demon now too? To be honest, she didn't know how she really felt right now, but it troubled her. Your brother is too kind for a demon, the man, who had introduced himself as Urokodaki, stated beside her. And you are clouded by your anger, he declared calmly. Nezuko bit her lip. How will that anger serve you? What will you do if your brother eats a human or protects another demon? Urokodaki demanded through her continued silence as he turned to face her. Don't talk about Oni-chan like that, she snapped at him as she clenched her hands by her sides. That anger tonight helped you in fighting with that demon. But you didn't answer my question. You can't. You know why? The man loomed over her before slapping her on the face, the pain rattling her. You let your emotions get the better of you, preventing you from making sound decisions right away. When your brother ends up doing those things, you raise your blade against him and kill him. Then you commit seppuku to atone for it. So you must do your best to make sure that will never happen. Do you understand? I know that. Her eyes, against her will, welled up with tears of frustration. But what am I supposed to do? I'm trying so hard to be strong, but I'm not. I'm not, okay? That had always been Oni-chan, and I can't just forget what one of those demons had done. I'm just so angry, I can't help it. What am I supposed to do? She furiously swiped at the tears that had fallen, hating that she was easy to tear up. Simple. You get stronger. Urokodaki declared as if it was that simple, unheeding of her crying. Right now, I'm going to test you to see if you've got what it takes to be a member of the demon-slaying corps. Go get your brother and follow me. He ordered her while she stared at him with wide eyes. Hi, she stumbled to her feet in surprise. Nezuko. A soft voice called out to her, and when she turned to look, she saw her older brother giving her a smile, and the sadness in his eyes made her uncomfortable. For a moment, she couldn't point out what was different, but it wasn't until she stared longer at those burgundy orbs that she realized it. This was Tanjiro when he was still human. Nezuko, he called out again. Why are you angry? His expression was that of helplessness, and it bothered Nezuko beyond belief for being the reason for it. Of course, I'm angry. She couldn't help it as her voice raised, the extent of her anger getting the better of her. They took everything from us. They turned you into a demon. How can I not be angry? She felt tears welling up in her eyes, unable to look at Tanjiro anymore for fear of the disappointment she might see. Then why do you fight? Her older brother's voice was as gentle as she remembered, and the pain of how much she missed it resonated within her. You have to understand, she thought adamantly to herself. I'm doing all of this for you. I'm going to avenge you and everyone. I will kill that demon. She breathed in deeply, those words engraved within her subconscious after how many times she'd vowed it. Nezuko. Gentle hands grabbed her face and turned it to face the regretful visage of her brother. Let go of your anger, please. He stated it as if it was that simple. No, how could she when it was all she had going on for her to get to this point, but helped her endure? Then why do you fight? But then again, that wasn't fully true either, was it? She still had Tanjiro. Her older brother was still with her. She still had to be a demon slayer and now had Urokodaki who would test her. She also had to show her eternal gratitude to Tomioka who had spared them. Then why do you fight? The pain was unbearable, even after all this time. She deflated at this realization. Because let go of your anger. Because please. Because I don't want to lose anyone anymore, she cried as she wrapped her arms around her brother. Please don't leave me, Oni-chan. She found herself sobbing, because she knew all along that letting go of her anger meant facing her fears, facing this pain. Tanjiro grabbed her by the shoulders and pushed her back to stare at her determinedly. She watched as his eyes became slitted, his hair shortened as the fangs started peeking out from under his upper lip. No matter what he'd become, he was still Tanjiro. He was still her kind brother. Of course, it went against his nature to needlessly kill anyone, be it demon or human. Then fight so you wouldn't lose anyone ever again. Her older brother encouraged, that familiar fondness lacing his words as he wiped her tears with his clawed fingers. Please don't be angry anymore, Nezuko. Her eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light. What happened? She asked groggily as she sat up, massaging her forehead. You passed out on the way here, Urokodaki answered from where he was sitting and drinking some tea. Nezuko's eyes widened at the implications. She remembered huffing and panting for breath, trying to catch up to the abnormally quick old man. She hadn't ran that much before, and it rapidly took its toll on her as her legs wobbled and strained while she desperately fought for air. Sometime after that, her world went dark and she had lost consciousness. Her older brother must be worried. Where's Oni-chan? She fretted only for the old man to point by the wall where her brother lay asleep. Why are there bandages wrapped around him? She turned to him accusingly, red eyes narrowed. He was the one who insisted on carrying you here, the man merely answered. As a demon, he got burned even when he tried to cover himself. But it's still a miracle that he's still alive. He lost consciousness as soon as we reached this place. She bit her bottom lip. Once again, she had failed. Making up her mind, she marched towards Urokodaki with determination flooding her veins. Please give me one more chance, Nezuko bowed to him, fervently hoping that this wasn't the end for her aspiration to be a demon slayer. But still, looking back on it, she now understood why her brother had stopped her. Being a demon slayer was not simply a job to slay demons, as she had repeatedly insisted through her anger. But it was a job that meant no one else would suffer the same fate their family had, that no more lives would be lost. Urokodaki was right. She let her emotions overwhelm her. Nezuko didn't know if it really had been her brother who'd spoken to her in that dream, but she understood now her real purpose. Get some rest first, and we'll start tomorrow, Urokodaki finally declared after a few tense minutes. But this is your last chance. Remember that, he warned her sternly. Thank you, Urokodaki Shishu. I won't let you down. She surprised the both of them when she tackled him for a hug. But it was a start. She'd find a cure for her brother and turn him back to human. Hurry up! Are your feet that heavy? Urokodaki barked harshly ahead of her. Nezuko panted as she strained to follow him. For some reason, the air was getting thinner the higher they went, and she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. The whole day, Urokodaki had her chopping wood for half a day, with slow success, before giving her a set of exercises that she had to do for the remainder of the day until the sun went up. For a moment, she'd thought that he was already testing her. But her intuition told her that he had something else up his sleeve, and it wasn't until her arms shook from exertion of having to swing her brother's heavy axe the whole morning that she was made aware of the fact that she was horribly out of shape. How did Tanjiro do this so effortlessly with a smile on his face? In fact, she suddenly understood why Takeo was mostly sullen when having been assigned this chore most of the time. She was easy to tire and, more often than not, her limbs betrayed her no matter how much she pushed herself. It was frustrating. And that was only day one. Though, after lunch break and dreading the afternoon already, the set of exercises the old man had given her was, to her surprise, like a breath of fresh air. They were exhausting, yes, but they didn't strain her muscles as much, and the pleasant soreness it left after made her lightheaded with relief. to say the least. She felt trepidation trickle in when Urokodaki asked her to climb up the mountain with him when night had settled in. Wait, Urokodaki-san. She wiped the sweat from her brow as she tried to catch up. Time waits for no one, the old man declared calmly, not even a smidgen of fatigue in his voice. The longer you dawdle, the shorter your time will be. He reprimanded a bit reproachfully, voice dipping low. Nezuko's breath hitched. This was it. Whatever he'd prepared for her, time was going to be a big factor. Still, this mountain gave her a weird feeling. It wasn't unpleasant, per se, but she just knew that it was not something she was going to be fond of. She thought of her older brother who was still worryingly asleep ever since they'd arrived yesterday, and she would be reminded that she needed to be strong. Even just so Tanjiro would stop having to pick up after her. The point was only driven home when Urokodaki had changed his bandages that morning, letting her see the burns on his face and arms from when the sunlight had touched him. They were still raw and inflamed, still bleeding in some places. The old man had told her that it had been worse yesterday. She dreaded the thought of how those could actually look worse, and for it to be healing at a slower rate meant that her older brother had really been affected badly by the sunlight. Her knees shook in exhaustion, but she endured it and took one step at a time. Now, from this point on, you will have to go back to the house by the foot of this mountain, Urokodaki announced as he halted in his tracks before turning to face her. Your brother and I will be waiting outside. You only have before sunrise. The old man continued steadily, ignoring the way her breath hitched. What are you talking about? She panted as she clenched her fists at the what-if. But then Oni-chan will be exposed to the sun, she found herself protesting. She started to get a bad feeling about this. Her intuition was piercing in its warning. Then that means you just need to make sure that you get down there before he dies, the man mercilessly delivered as he took a step back and started to disappear into the mist. Nezuko felt her expression contort into something ugly as fury flowed through her veins, recalling the sight of burnt skin and an unconscious Tanjiro. Don't you dare, she snarled at him, only to scream in frustration when he finally disappeared. That old bastard. She crouched on her knees, prepared to run after him because he had just threatened her brother's life right in her face. Let go of your anger. Her brother's soft voice echoed in her head, effectively freezing her in her tracks. She took a deep breath to wrestle the ugly emotion back until it left nothing but annoyance in its wake. Now that she hadn't let it get the best of her, Nezuko could now recall his earlier promise before they had climbed this mountain, I will look after your brother. When Urokodaki had assured her without her even asking him to. She tried to recall the peace that the thought granted her at that time, her intuition thrumming pleasantly. No, what her intuition had been cautioning her a while ago was from letting Urokodaki get in her head. This was part of the test. Because, of course, the old man would like to drive home the fact that she still let her emotions overwhelm her. I'm sorry, Oni-chan, she apologized under her breath in shame. Nezuko was trying, she really was. Thankfully, she had a good sense of direction compared to all her siblings, so she could still pinpoint her way down back to Urokodaki's house. What she was dreading, what her intuition was telling her, was that the journey downwards would not be as easy. So, she carefully observed her surroundings as she took several steps, almost walking into a hidden pitfall before continuing on in a slow approach. It was taking a while. Nezuko then realized that being overly cautious would take her too much time. At this rate, she would never pass the test to become a demon slayer and cure her brother. Swallowing her reservations, she squared her shoulders before breaking out into a run. Her intuition blared in response, but before she could properly pinpoint it, she tripped on something and felt rocks assaulting her face. The pain was sharp and startling to her, making her tumble on the ground roughly, scraping her palms. Must not give up, she encouraged herself as she stood up on shaky legs and continued to run. Nezuko stepped into another rope, but her intuition was faster this time, and she had been able to dodge the oncoming log from her back. Though, seeing as she wasn't fast enough, it managed to graze her side and send her tumbling into another trap, which was another pitfall, now full of mud, making it harder to climb back up. Her breath now came in wheezes, and the lack of air was starting to make her panic and unable to think clearly. Maybe she was going at this the wrong way. Continuously stumbling into the traps was obviously getting her nowhere, so she would have to somehow be able to avoid them. But her senses weren't sharp enough to quickly catch onto them on time. She wasn't athletic, and her reaction time was even worse. Was this her limit after all? But she was just getting started. Once again, tears of frustration leaked out of her eyes, and she couldn't help but think that if it were her brother here, he would have already found a way. Then fight so you wouldn't lose anyone ever again. Tanjiro's words resonated in her heart. If she was giving up here, then she would never be able to protect anything. Slapping her cheeks as she combed her long, muddy hair out of her face, she took a deep, steadying breath before clawing her way out of the pitfall with a yell. Taking deep breaths, she was determined to stumble her way down this mountain. Because if she didn't, Nezuko didn't know what would happen to her brother otherwise. This was her last chance after all. Hang in there, Oni-chan. She collapsed forward on the door panting, her forehead smacking into it with a loud bang, just as the sky was starting to light up. But there was no sun yet. Nezuko felt absolutely tired, sleep-deprived, and sore all over. Her long hair was tangled, her clothes muddied and ruined, and she had gashes on her arms, face, legs, and she just wanted to lie down and sleep through the pain. Though, the only thing keeping her upright was the sense of accomplishment thrumming under her skin. She had done it. The more traps she walked in on, the better her intuition was in reacting. Just didn't mean that she was magically able to follow up on it. Still, she was here. That meant something, right? The door suddenly slammed open, making her trip into the doorway with a squeak as she lost her support, before she was caught and enveloped in a warm hug. Blinking almost drearily, she remained frozen in surprise. Though, her eyes slowly widened as she took in the familiar burgundy strands by her face and realized that her brother was awake. He was hugging her. She was hurting all over. But even so, she wouldn't have been able to do this without him, without the thought of him waiting for her, encouraging her. Before she knew it, she was returning his embrace just as fiercely, a wide smile stretching her lips. "You're awake, Oni-chan," she gushed in pure happiness, feeling her chest lighten as she could now wash away the worry of him never waking up. Nezuko felt his arms tighten around her for one painful second before he let go. Her older brother then slung her arm over his shoulder and helped her enter Urokodaki's home, where the old man was staring at the both of them in silence. Nezuko knew that she should feel assured. She had fulfilled his conditions after all. But she couldn't help the spike of anxiety as he remained that way without saying anything. Did she fail after all? Didn't do it right? She knew that she might have activated all those traps on the way here, but he didn't say that she wasn't supposed to. "I guess you've got what it takes to be my student after all," he eventually remarked as he crossed his arms. "I do?" she repeated before realizing the impact of his words. I do," she cheered as she turned to tell her older brother of the good news. But then she'd already fainted due to fatigue. "Every time I see it, I can't help but still question my eyes," Urokodaki remarked from beside her. Nezuko tightened her arms around her knees, feeling a slight pang of longing. "Oni-chan performed this dance once when our father was then too ill and couldn't get out of bed. It's a family tradition to offer a dance to the god of fire at the beginning of the year and pray to him." She smiled sadly at this, missing her family more than ever. "Ever since he died, I don't think I've seen Oni-chan do this dance again, being too busy taking care of us in his place. To be honest, I thought he'd forgotten it." She mused to herself, glad that something of their late father still lived on. "It's halfway through the year," the old man noted almost absent-mindedly, still obviously entranced by her brother. "Then I guess Oni-chan is making up for the start of this year that he missed," Nezuko smiled brightly. Tanjiro had removed his checkered haori in place of a dark haori over his usual clothes. On his face, he was donning a Tengu mask, courtesy of her mentor, as he waved a branch of leaves in tandem with his dance, while the bamboo muzzle lay snuggled around his neck bound by the cloth. She'd seen him perform it once, all flailing limbs and clumsy steps, but she imagined that the demon blood in his veins had given him a better body coordination and sense of balance, as he was more graceful than she remembered. It was beautiful, especially with the light of the torches surrounding him. He started performing this, apparently, when she had shown her older brother some of the water-breathing katas that Urokodaki started teaching her. Nezuko guessed that it reminded him of their father's Kagura dance. It wasn't until one time when the old man had remarked that her brother was acting strange that she even bothered to stay up late, despite her exhaustion, to see what was going on. To say that she was surprised was an understatement. Nezuko could still remember the tears she'd shed when she realized that she recognized those forms. Her brother continued until dawn, a slight hesitation in his actions as if he was having trouble recalling each stance, each movement. But now, he was all sharp motions and graceful steps as he performed it once more. She was glad to see him active this time, as her brother had taken to sleeping irregularly. Sometimes awake for days, and other times asleep for weeks or more than a month. She always dreaded the latter as her worries came to the surface once again. This time he'd been asleep for 2 weeks, and she was just glad to see him awake. Urokodaki assumed that it was her brother's way of recuperating in place of consuming human flesh. Red eyes blinked in surprise when Tanjiro stepped in front of her and offered her his hand. A delighted grin graced her features as she took it, her older brother handing her another branch full of leaves and gesturing for her to mimic his movements. Nezuko laughed as she pushed herself to stand up and let the older boy pull her in as well. All right, she beamed. This was also something new, as he had taken to asking her to accompany him on his dances, but it was a quality time with her brother that she deeply treasured. Since Nezuko already knew, despite her hopes, that Tanjiro wasn't wholly there either. He still recognized her, was still that kind-hearted brother, but it seemed as if someone tore him apart and tried to put him back together where the pieces weren't put back properly. 6 months had already passed since that fateful day Urokodaki had called her his student. Urokodaki still had her climbing and descending down the mountain every morning in order to improve her awareness and reaction time. And every time, she would walk away with bruises all over because the traps were never the same each day, growing more dangerous than the last. She knew that setting those up took time and work, and Nezuko felt moved at the thought that he was putting that much effort for her training. Her progress was slow as she tended to flail and panic in the face of those traps. Her intuition was not the only thing that got better in these months as the old man tried to train her other senses. He sometimes had her blindfolded when descending the mountain of doom, so she had been forced to improvise and rely on her other senses. It wasn't easy, seeing as she didn't have the enhanced senses of other people like her brother, so she had to put her faith in her own intuition and capability. It only got harder when, after 2 months, Urokodaki had her running down with a sword tied to her waist. She still wasn't used to the additional weight and extra appendage, so her sense of balance became skewed, more often than not, hindering her and getting her caught into more traps than she was proud of. Other times, she was just carrying it on her hands. The old man still had the habit of always trying to provoke her, and Nezuko could now proudly claim that she started to react less rashly. The afternoons were dedicated to swinging the sword 1,000 times. Depending on the old man's mood, he'd had her swinging it till it felt like her arms would fall off. And when he had been trying to teach her about breathing techniques and the katas that came with it, he mercilessly beat her to the ground. And that was beside the times when he wasn't throwing her off a cliff, over his shoulder, or against a tree. She had taken to keeping her hair in a single long braid. Its length was something that her mother had always complimented, so she couldn't bring herself to cut it despite Urokodaki's reprimands how it would be used against her in a fight. Still, with his help, she had that braid pinned up with 3 sturdy golden pins, and when she asked what were the flower designs engraved into it, he told her that it was wisteria. Urokodaki was really hard on her. But, truthfully, Nezuko appreciated that. Because as she slowly met his expectations, she also saw the growth she had undergone these past few months, no matter how drawn out it felt. And Nezuko was just so happy that she might have a chance at her goal after all. Greetings, Tomioka-san. I know that it was a month ago when I last wrote a letter to you. Fear not, as Urokodaki-san finally gave me the time to write to you. He told me that you're finishing up a mission to hunt down a demon that was stalking and kidnapping children in several villages. Best of luck to you. I hope you finally put an end to that demon, and that this letter reaches you well regardless. Today, Urokodaki-san threw me off a cliff once again down into the waterfall. No worries, I made it out safely. I can also now go down the mountain avoiding most of the traps, but sometimes I have the feeling that Urokodaki-san is trying to kill me. Don't tell him I said that, though. A while ago, he finally let me prepare dinner. It wasn't as good as Onii-chan's cooking, but Urokodaki-san said that it tasted good. It was supposed to be a celebration for Onii-chan's birthday today. I even invited you last time, but I guess that it's fine that you hadn't come, especially with your mission. Ever since Onii-chan went to sleep 5 days ago, he hasn't woken up since. I know that it's been happening frequently, and that his slumber is getting longer and longer. I'm just afraid that one day, he would really sleep for eternity and leave me. Nezuko paused in writing her letter as her red eyes strayed to the silent form of her older brother. She had been hoping that he would wake up, considering what day it was, but whatever the demon blood had been doing to him, Tanjiro remained blissfully asleep. It was just 5 days ago when he braided her hair and decorated it with flowers. It was something he always used to do for her when they were younger, and he also did it for Hanako when she was born. There hadn't been a single day when she didn't miss their family. Some part of her was even hoping to one day wake up and realize that everything was just a bad dream. But she couldn't let those thoughts cloud her judgment, as she couldn't falter right now. Her older brother was also depending on her. Every day, she always swung her sword with the intent to protect, not hurt, and Nezuko found tranquility in that way of thinking. Still, killing that monster was not far from her thoughts. She wouldn't let that man take anyone else from her ever again. I'll protect you, Onii-chan, Nezuko swore as she grabbed her brother's limp hand. I swear I will, she promised as she hastily wiped her eyes from when they swelled with tears, telling herself to keep it together. How she longed for the day when she could converse normally with her older brother again, to hear his gentle voice, to bask in his warm assurances, or even just to let her know how he was doing now that he was a demon. He could barely speak as it is, and most of the time, he relied on his gestures for her to understand him. But for now, she would take what she could get, and Nezuko was content with having him by her side. With that, she let go of his hand and continued writing her letter. That sounds a bit morbid, doesn't it? I apologize. I know that I'll never get a reply from this like all the other letters I've sent you. But I wished you would stop by and see us. I'm sure that even Urokodaki-san misses you. Warm wishes. Kamado Nezuko. She folded the letter and set it on her desk. Tomorrow, she'd ask Urokodaki if his crow could deliver it for her once again. After stretching her arms over her head, she edged towards her brother and leaned in to kiss him on the forehead, like their mother always used to do for them. Happy birthday, Onii-chan, she whispered gently. I have nothing more to teach you, Urokodaki finally told her after more than a year since she and her brother arrived in this mountain. Who cares if it seems impossible? Nezuko complained under her breath as she swung her sword down again. Then I'll just do the impossible, she yelled in frustration as she swung down her arms again, breathing heavily and trying to regain some semblance of control, because, otherwise, she might just lose it and proceed to either lash out or break down crying. It had already been more than 3 months since Urokodaki had given his final verdict. She was to slice that boulder to gain his permission to let her enter the final selection. And it was now up to Nezuko where to go from there. To be honest, she had floundered at the start. She had tried to slice the boulder from the get-go. Thankfully, her sword hadn't snapped as Urokodaki's threat of hacking her hair off until she was bald and bleeding still echoed in her head. What a scary old man. He always knew where it would hurt the most. Still, Nezuko knew that it would take more than simply striking it with her blade to even make a dent. She might now be able to swing her sword like an extension of herself, but it never meant that her strength was up to par as to be able to slice through that large thing. For the past months, she had continued with her everyday routine of training even without Urokodaki to supervise. Just to go beyond her limits, she had continued through the night till exhaustion claimed her. Some nights, she would wake up where she fell asleep in the woods. Other times, when Tanjiro wasn't asleep, she'd wake up with her head on her brother's lap as he watched over her back at Urokodaki's home where he'd carried her back. It was easier to give up, she knew, but she had already reached this far from that weak girl that had simply begged for her brother's life to even think of faltering. Then there was the fact that Tanjiro had gone to sleep last month and hadn't woken up since. Truthfully, her worry was weighing down her mind on most nights, and it was further emphasized by the fact that the number of mornings she'd wake up without him was increasing. So, she focused on her training to take her mind off of it, and gave it her all. Even if her hands were left raw and blistered, rough with calluses from training, she persevered. Nezuko knew that she was stretching herself thin. But it was the only thing that kept her going so the loneliness wouldn't continue to fester. It had already been more than a year since their family died. She was grateful to Urokodaki as he had given her a break on the anniversary of their death. Tanjiro, who was thankfully awake on that distressing time, was there to light up some incense and pray with her. Nezuko wasn't certain if he remembered them completely, but she was glad that some part of him acknowledged the time of their passing. Only her older brother's presence stopped her spiraling thoughts that just wanted to give up at this point. I'm trying, she whispered under her breath, hating that familiar surge of helplessness. Today, again, is another mark of my failure, but I'm not giving up. I can't. If I have room for despair at my lack of progress, then I still have more energy to expend in swinging my sword. Every single day, I thought about why I am doing this. A blade swung out of hatred can't cut through anything, as Urokodaki-sen had constantly taught me. I already know that. Cultivating animosity was not something I wanted in the first place. I've already decided that I'm using my blade to protect. But just memorizing all these exercises and forms aren't enough. Tomioka-sen, what do you think a blade can protect? There was something off about how Urokodaki hadn't questioned her progress with the boulder. Not even once. She knew that he had already claimed that it was now up to her if she could improve beyond her level, but it didn't sit well with her. Nezuko had a sinking feeling as to why, but she didn't want to acknowledge it just yet. That he might not want her to enter the final selection. So, they had been dancing and skirting around the topic of her final obstacle. Talking about mundane things, about Tanjiro, about her late family, and even just Urokodaki's old age. She didn't bring up her goal of becoming a demon slayer, and he didn't say anything about the passing time that seemed to make that goal seem far off. She felt that Urokodaki wasn't being cruel to her, but she didn't want to question him because she had wanted to prove him wrong instead. Nezuko was now on the 5th month mark since, and she was still not closer to slicing that boulder. Entering the room that she shared with her slumbering brother, Nezuko froze by the doorway at the empty room. No Tanjiro within sight. For a moment, she couldn't seem to process what she was looking at. As she blinked her red eyes again, she took in the neatly folded sheets by the corner and the missing checkered haori she usually hung by the wall. Nezuko then stumbled on her feet as she broke out into a run outside the house to search for him. "Oniai-chan," she yelled for him as she ran, heart frantically beating. Pausing, Nezuko took a deep breath to calm down. Her older brother normally always went to see her first upon waking up. At this time of the night, she was usually by the forest, still swinging her sword, or by the boulder where she would try to test her strength once again. Earlier, when she came back to Urokodaki's house, she had just finished by the forest. That only left one place. She skidded on the ground as she turned around and made to run the opposite direction. "Don't panic," she urged herself as she hastened her steps. Onii-chan wouldn't leave, she thought confidently. But with his enhanced sense of smell, he should have been able to locate her. Breathing heavily, she leaned against the tree's trunk as she caught sight of Tanjiro sitting cross-legged on top of the boulder with his back facing her. Clenching her fists to mask her worry, she jogged towards the burgundy-haired boy. "Onii-chan," Nezuko called out, huffing. "You're awake. What are you doing there?" she questioned as she got closer, feeling a surge of relief as Tanjiro blinked at her over his shoulder, tilting his head at her. It had been 3 months. Tanjiro had slept for 3 months. His eyes curved towards her in a smile before he faced front again. Curious about his strange behavior, Nezuko walked around the boulder to see what was going on. However, she pulled her sword out of reflex as she blocked a sudden attack towards her person. Red eyes widened as she came face to face with a fox mask before her foe pushed off of her and jumped back, landing beside the boulder. Her intuition flared, a discomfort thrumming underneath her skin. There was something wrong about this person. Weak, pessimistic, sluggish. The masked figure spoke haltingly in a surprisingly deep voice. "I've been observing you for some time now. Did you really learn anything?" he demanded as he surged forwards again to clash with her, his wooden sword heavy against her blade as she tried to shift her stance to push him back. To her surprise, he went with her movement to deliver an unforgiving kick towards her unprotected middle, sending her a few feet back as she roughly landed on the ground. She didn't have time to recuperate before she saw him swinging his sword towards her head once again. Nezuko raised her sword to block it once more, but the force behind it was so powerful that she felt her wrist straining against it. Gripping the hilt tightly, she redirected the blow towards the ground before she twisted her body to stagger on her feet and intending to deliver a blow with her spin. However, her intuition blared. He was faster as he merely swung his sword to the side sharply, hitting her and sending her a few feet away. "Who are you?" she asked quietly as she slowly climbed to her feet. "You don't have the right to know if you can't even defeat me," he declared as he held his wooden sword with both hands. The nerve of this guy. But really, he wasn't wrong, and that really rubbed her the wrong way. "You haven't mastered the breathing technique yet that Urokodaki-sen had taught you. What were you doing all this time that you've been here?" he asked lowly, form as still as water. Nezuko's hands tightened painfully around the hilt of her sword. Since her whole life had been upended, all she had done was endure. She had chosen to fight. All the things she could do now, she could only dream of it from before. Because all the time she had dedicated to fighting, she had endured. It was a hard pill to swallow that it might not have been enough. Before either of them could move again, Tanjiro swiftly landed between them, effectively cutting off their glaring. Nezuko had almost forgotten about his presence. He was tilting his head at the masked unknown, someone who knew of Urokodaki and his teachings. She watched as her peach-haired assailant became rigid when her older brother approached him. To her surprise, he didn't attack Tanjiro and let the burgundy-haired boy to circle him in curiosity. Tanjiro rubbed his nose as his brows furrowed before he went back to visually inspecting the quiet boy. Then, he shifted the bamboo down from his mouth and turned to her with bright eyes. "Gi," he spoke slowly with his fangs in full view. "Yuu," he clapped his hands in triumph. Nezuko's grip loosened in confusion. Her brother seemed to sense this as he gestured wildly towards the other boy. "Gi-yuu," he repeated haltingly, forcing the words out. For a moment, she remained clueless. However, repeating what Tanjiro was saying in her head over and over again, she realized that she recognized those words, particularly that name. Her head snapped to the other and realized what her brother was pointing at. This masked boy was wearing a colorful patterned kimono top that was awfully familiar. In fact, she had been busy defending and planning against him that she hadn't even thought to pay close attention to his appearance. "That's not Tomioka-san," she exasperatedly told her brother, who shook his head insistently. The stance was similar, but this boy and the dark-haired teen carried themselves differently, and they looked entirely too different. Tomioka was a rather memorable person, after all. Nezuko wouldn't forget him so easily. "Jiwoo?" the peach-haired boy cut in, sounding surprised as he straightened from his stance. "A month ago, I met a couple of people who were willing to train with me. I haven't learned their names. They told me that if I get to beat one of them, then I can earn the right to learn them." It was a boy whose face was perpetually covered by a ceramic kitsune mask. He was very insistent that I should engrave Urokodaki-san's teachings into my bones and into my whole being. Every single day, he would charge and attack me out of nowhere. It didn't matter that he was wielding a wooden sword against my blade, despite my initial reservations, and he was relentless. I could still remember the day that he knocked me out cold. His form was graceful, not a single movement wasted, just like you. "Do you think I would be able to be like you both someday?" The other one was a girl with gentle eyes. She would patch up my wounds and offer words of advice about my form, my awful tendencies in messing up said form, or even just the advantages of the breathing technique that Urokodaki-san had taught me. Sometimes I also spar with her, and she's very fast. She's giving me some tips on how to be quick on my feet. Onii-chan seemed to like them. Whenever nighttime comes, he would spend some of his time following after the boy or picking flowers with the girl. It's surprising that they don't mind his presence considering that they know he's a demon. They even got to witness one of Onii-chan's Kegura dance, and I am grateful because their praises for it had made my brother absolutely happy. You should see it too should you decide to visit. Tomioka-san, these people clearly care for Urokodaki-san, though he never mentioned them. In fact, they even know you. The boy asked me not to reveal anything specific about them, but he wanted to pass a message. He said that you would understand what it meant. For some reason, he seemed insistent that you know of this. They're still with you, Jiwoo. Don't waste your chance. You should have more faith in your strength, Nezuko. The smaller girl offered her a small smile of encouragement. Her cheeks warmed at the indirect praise. "It's not that I don't have faith in myself," she started out gently, smiling fondly as she watched Tanjiro inserting flowers into the other girl's braid. "For years, I've grown up always looked after by my parents and older brother. I've always tried to be like them when my other siblings were born. But out of all of us, Onii-chan has always been the figure of strength in our family. He's been always so kind and warm. Ever since our family was killed, it's an eye-opener to realize how much I've come to rely on that strength. I don't know if I can live up to it, especially when he needs me the most." She sighed as she leaned back on her hands. Nezuko's eyes widened when she felt her older brother's hand enclose around hers, giving it a gentle squeeze. His burgundy eyes were calm as they stared over her. "I think you can still rely on him, flower girl," something Nezuko called her, told her gently. "You don't have to shoulder all of that alone. After all, he's still your older brother, right?" Her blue-green eyes stared pointedly at the burgundy-haired boy behind her. As if on cue, Tanjiro reached over and patted Nezuko on the head, like he always used to do. That day when Tomioka had come to kill her brother, Nezuko remembered thinking that no matter what he'd become, he'd always be her brother. Despite how he lost some of himself to his demon transformation, Nezuko hadn't once thought of him any other way, because, demon or human, he remained his kind self. She once asked Tanjiro how he had remained so strong, especially after their father had died, shouldering their family on his small shoulders. "It's because I'm the eldest child," he had answered back then, a quiet smile on his lips. "I want to be someone all of you can count on." And hadn't that answer made all the difference to her back then? "Your strength is yours alone," the girl spoke confidently, without any doubt in her voice. Instead of thinking of living up to someone's strength, live up to your own. In the end, the only obstacle that's stopping you from moving forward will always be yourself after all. She declared so easily, as if it was that simple. Myself, huh? She mused as she stared at her calloused hands. Put more power into that swing, Kitsune, as she had taken to calling him since he still wouldn't reveal his name, barked at her harshly as he deflected her attack with a flick of his sword. Brows furrowing in determination, she ducked under his swing and aimed for his torso with concentrated powerful slash. She was able to cut into his white haori as he jumped back, knowing that if she gave him enough breathing room, he would strike back twice as hard, and that would be the end of her. So Nezuko jumped after him, relentless in her pursuit as they jumped in circles on the ground. He suddenly twisted on his feet as he switched his grip on his sword before trying to take her head off with a stab that was almost too fast for her to see. Bending back to avoid the hit, she stabbed her sword on the ground for support and used it as leverage to deliver a spinning kick towards his head. The tips of her zori managed to graze his mask, but she didn't wait for him to jump back before she straightened up once again. You concentrate too much on defense, the other remarked gruffly as he propped his wooden sword on his shoulder. Your offense is lacking. Is that all you can do? He taunted her, voice completely challenging. It was thanks to her brother's friendship with this boy that Nezuko discovered that he purposely went out of his way to rile her up. She'd like to think that it was to get her fired up and fight him with all she got. She didn't exactly know what kind of face she made at the thought of her brother. But she squeaked in surprise when, in her sudden distraction, she almost didn't see his sword aimed for her head before she brought up her blade to block it and leapt back. Stop worrying, the peach-haired boy told her calmly. Your brother will wake up. He declared it so matter-of-factly, not even a hint of uncertainty in his tone. I know that. It's not the first time, Nezuko exhaled sharply at this. But that doesn't mean I will stop worrying about him, she announced unwaveringly, her red-eyed gaze boring into the dark holes of his mask. Tanjiro had fallen into one of his slumbers again 2 months after he'd woken up. And that was 3 months ago. She'd been training with Kitsune and Flower Girl for 5 months now. It kept her busy from overthinking his state, and the company had dulled any loneliness in her heart. Her older brother would be glad that his newfound friends had been looking after her. At least, he could also stop worrying over her whenever he realized how much time had passed in his sleep. Then come, Kitsune beckoned her to attack with his hand. Nezuko steeled herself and charged. 2 months after that, Kitsune told her that it was time. Nezuko didn't question him. Flower Girl had been urging her since last month to finally challenge the peach-haired boy for the final time. She had put it off because she had been hoping that Tanjiro would wake up and witness how much she'd grown. Sadly, he remained asleep, and it honestly broke her heart that she couldn't wait for him any longer. After all, it had already been approximately a year since Yorikodaki's verdict, and the final selection was looming closer. So, here she was now, standing across Kitsune still disheveled from her earlier training with her sword held steadily, while he unsheathed his sword, a real blade this time, further accentuating the finality of this moment. Can you at least tell me your names? Nezuko asked them, pursing her lips. You know what to do, the other boy merely retorted. When they charged at each other, Nezuko swung her sword down immediately. Not with her arms, but with her whole being, projecting all her strength into that one swing. She followed the thrum of her intuition, letting it guide her blade. His sword cluttered on the ground from the force while his mask was cleanly sliced along the middle. Red eyes blinked in wonder as she met gentle eyes that reminded her of Tanjiro, and an equally melancholic smile that looked a bit out of place on his scarred face. It was relieved, it was proud, it was sad. Don't ever hesitate. Remember this power that you have within you. The peach-haired boy's eyes softened. I am Sabito. It is an honor, Kamado Nezuko. He finally introduced himself after all these months as he straightened. And my name is Makomo. Flower Girl stepped beside her. Take care of yourself and Tanjiro. Don't forget what you just did. Go out and win, okay, Nezuko? And beat him too." She smiled at the dark-haired girl as she disappeared into the mist, like how Urokodaki tended to do at the mountains. Facing forward to Sabito once more, her eyes widened when the mist around her cleared to reveal the sliced boulder. "What?" She stared with confusion, unable to believe that she had done this. But Sabito. Confusion seemed to war with a gentle hum of her intuition. Despite her bafflement, there was a sense of peace, and her intuition hadn't been wrong so far. Whatever purpose Sabito and Makomo had when they'd come into their lives, it had now been fulfilled. It was one of the hardest goodbyes she'd had to deal with. Urokodaki found her sitting cross-legged across the boulder with her sword cradled on her lap. "I didn't intend to send you on the final selection," he eventually said once he reached her, standing beside her as they both stared at the boulder. "I didn't want to see any more children dying, and I was certain that you wouldn't be able to do it. I see it's my fault for doubting your resolve." His voice was regretful as he said this. "I know that you didn't want me to do it," Nezuko replied quietly, remembering how he had let her be on her own. "But I just wanted to set things right so badly. I can't even bear to give up." Her voice became choked with tears. The old man then crouched beside her, taking her into his arms. "You've done well, Nezuko," he whispered in her ear gently, and the pride in it made the tears fall even harder. "You are an amazing child, alongside your brother. Just make sure that you come back alive from the selection. Tanjiro and I will be waiting." His arms tightened around her, and Nezuko allowed herself to lean on him, to cry out her relief. That these past 2 years weren't for nothing. It just sunk in now that she had done it. "Then fight so you wouldn't lose anyone ever again." Tanjiro's voice was a persistent echo in her heart. She would make sure of it. "I've finally done it. Urokodaki-san had finally given me his blessings. I'll be departing the day after tomorrow for Mount Fujikasen, as the final selection process would occur by the end of the week. Oniai-chan still hasn't woken up, so it was only Urokodaki-san and I who celebrated my accomplishment. He cooked a lot of hot pot for us. I think I ate enough for both Oniai-chan and I." He explained to me the concept of a demon's strength based on the number of humans they consumed. It made me think about Oniai-chan's circumstance. I've never seen him crave for humans, let alone blood. That's weird, right? I know that Urokodaki-san assumed that his slumbers were helping him gather some power. But my intuition's telling me that something isn't right. Tomioka-san, this is the last time I'm asking this from you, but I was hoping you can visit us. Wish me luck. He still couldn't get close to Sajiri Mountain, as the former water pillar would surely sniff him out, as the human had almost done a couple of times. But it's been a long time since he'd last fought a water pillar from the demon slaying corps, so maybe he just had to confront him and kill him too. This was hindering his other missions, and he still had no idea why Kibutsuji Musen would go out of his way for this demon. But he still had his mission to fulfill: find the demon with the Hanafuda earrings. Oniai-chan. Nezuko's voice was always warm and soft, so to hear the barely concealed alarm in it worried him. As he stared at her over his shoulder, the smell of fear washed over his senses, and it was even more concerning to get it from his usually cheerful sister. "Nezuko," he called out to her, brows furrowing in worry. "Is something wrong?" Tanjiro was quick to ask, knowing that she only had these bouts when she felt something was wrong. He had always trusted her judgment. Her sixth sense was better than anyone Tanjiro had met so far, and it always helped them when his nose couldn't smell it right away. Nezuko's sense of danger was sharp, and she always made good decisions. Whatever she had to say was obviously important, so he patiently waited for whatever she had to say. Tanjiro watched as uncertainty flashed across her face, noticeably torn about something, before giving him a small, anxious smile. "Please make sure that you come back tonight," she declared, the distress in her voice almost pleading to him. To be honest, there was only one response to that. As if Tanjiro could outright deny Nezuko about this, especially when she rarely asked for anything. Of course, he smiled, nodding resolutely. I promise to come back early. He gave her his word, already planning his route in town if he wanted to sell as much charcoal in the time frame he had if he wanted to make it back tonight. Tanjiro waved back to her vigorously before continuing his trek. He was glad to smell the relief that his assurance had given her. With that in mind, he decided that he would focus on selling charcoals only. Last time, it had taken him a whole day because he'd gotten carried away with helping the elderly with their troubles, not to mention listening to the interesting stories every person in town would give him. Shaking his head, he headed to town with a purpose. "Hey, Tanjiro!" A familiar voice called out to him as he climbed back the mountain. He felt accomplished. While it pained him that he had to decline requests for assistance on his journey to sell charcoals, his promise to his sister took precedence above all else. He internally swore to himself that he'd make up for it the next time he had to go down. Thankfully, the townsfolk were understanding. They had praised his dedication in working in this weather and cited their support since it was going to be New Year's Eve. Tanjiro turned around to address the person who called out to him. "Ah, Saburo-san," he waved jovially to him. "You're going back up the mountain?" the old man asked him, face worried as the burgundy-haired boy nodded. "Then hurry up before it gets too late, you hear me? Go straight back home. You don't want to run into any demons after dark." His voice lowered and Tanjiro didn't need his nose to be able to identify the apprehension in his tone. "I've got a good nose for trouble," Tanjiro reminded him. "I'll be fine. Don't worry, I need to get back early anyway." He gave a small laugh at this. Saburo seemed skeptical at this, even looking miffed that the boy didn't seem to be taking him seriously. But he waved him off, urging him to hurry on. Tanjiro waved one last time before continuing his trek. He'd arrived there after sundown, so Saburo didn't need to worry too much. Maybe the man was feeling lonely because he lived alone, having lost his family. If that was the case, he'd bring his younger siblings with him next time. Though, he paused in thought. There's no such thing as demons, he mused to himself as he stared at the sky. Right? But he felt as if he was forgetting something. True to his expectations, it was already dark when he'd arrived by their home. He wanted to be wrong, so wrong. But the smell of blood in the air didn't lie. Hurriedly removing the basket from his back, he ran towards the entryway. The smell of iron and death was so overwhelming that he had to cover his nose, fear for his family taking hold of his limbs unlike any other. Further entering their home, his eyes took in the blood-spattered walls and bodies of his family, of his mother and Hanako, of Takeo and Shidru. That was when he saw the figure of an elegantly dressed man standing over Nezuko and Rokuta, the former trying to reach out for the still form of their youngest brother. "Nezuko," he took a step forward, absolutely scared out of his mind as his eyes met her wide red eyes. No, not them, please, not them. His mind kept going in circles. It was all happening too fast for him. Raising his gaze to stare at the man, at his family's murderer, he didn't know what to feel as he encountered plum red eyes, the slits making it almost cat-like. The scent emanating from this person was unlike anything he'd smelled before, and dare he say it, it didn't seem anything close to human. His gaze slid downwards to the blood dripping from those claw-like hands. "Ah," he thought absent-mindedly. "Now that I think about it, my grandmother said the same thing as Saburo-san before she died." "What do we have here?" The man spoke in a smooth, deep voice that effectively snapped him out of his stupor. Now was not the time, after all. The resemblance is absolutely revolting. To think that the legacy of that human continues to live on. He pondered out loud, the air seeming to vibrate from the seething anger he was emanating, and not to mention. It was for a moment, but Tanjiro knew he didn't imagine it. "Who are you?" he demanded as he frantically searched his mind to get them out of this situation, trying to bury his pain at the thought of his family's death. Because aside from the smell of blood that permeated the air, Nezuko's silent rage, and this unknown stench, there was nothing. No scent of pain, of suffering, or anything that told him they were alive. But he still had to make sure. Maybe, why are you doing this? Why us? Do you know us? Earlier, I know I didn't imagine it. But I smelled. He swore that he didn't blink, but the next thing he knew, his feet was in the air, and it was as if the oxygen was being squeezed out of his lungs as he struggled and clawed at the hand crushing his neck. Tanjiro's eyes snapped open when he felt the man's breath next to his ear, not having noticed that he'd closed them in the first place. I want to kill you so badly. The man whispered in his ear, voice a low rumble. I want to end you before your life can truly begin, and I'm going to enjoy it. But just death would be easy. It would be a mercy for someone like you. No, I'm going to make you suffer in your last moments. I have the entire night after all. The smile in his voice was unmistakable, and the dread that ran deep in Tanjiro's soul at those words was staggering. Whoever this man was, he clearly hated Tanjiro. The words were out of his mouth before he could stop them. Then why are you scared? He rasped out quietly. He caught a flash of fear in the other's sent once again as the hand tightened around his neck, those plum red eyes bulging out in fury. Though, his own terror was replaced by something more desperate as he saw Nezuko standing behind the man, clutching onto one of their mother's kitchen knives. His lips moved, trying to form words, as he now tried harder to get out of the man's grip. No, Nezuko, get out of here. This man is not human. Please, save yourself. Run, I beg you. The words didn't make it out of his lips, and he could only watch as anger unlike anything he'd seen on her before contort her beautiful face. Let go of Oniai-chan, leave him alone. He heard her scream in anger as she darted towards the man, intending on stabbing him. Tanjiro remembered the day when his mother gave birth to his first sibling. He recalled how Nezuko had blinked wide red eyes open, small arms reaching out for him. There had been wonder, excitement, and an overwhelming warm feeling that he would later learn was called love. It didn't matter how many years it had been since that day, but he knew deep within him that he would always wholeheartedly love his sister, as he did for the rest of his siblings. In that moment, he understood that that same sister was going to be killed in front of him as she dashed towards them. Nezuko, he roared in rage as he did the only thing he could. Tanjiro stretched his neck as far as it could go as he pulled on the man's hand with all his strength. He then bit the man's forearm. Hard. It didn't break easily as it would of a normal person's, but fueled by his desperation. Tanjiro merely tightened his jaws around it until his teeth sunk into it, ignoring how it tore into the flesh as blood flooded his mouth. The man might have shouted, but Tanjiro was driven by instinct at this point, not letting go. He was swung into Nezuko with such force that she was thrown against the wall and knocked unconscious. You disgusting little, the man, demon, was yelling as he tried to remove Tanjiro off of his arm once again. This time, Tanjiro let go, roughly landing on his knees as a weird sensation overtook him. As soon as he got to breathe easier once out of the chokehold, he'd made the mistake of swallowing. Right now, his breaths came in gasps, feeling the whole of his mouth and throat burning. He tried to claw on his neck and chin desperately, to get it out or what, he wasn't sure. He only stopped once his wide eyes took in the man who, in his distraction, was now getting closer to the unconscious form of his sister. He might have screamed something, but all that went out of his mouth were incoherent guttural sounds as he pounced on the other. Tanjiro didn't know where this sudden strength was coming from, but as the man gripped his arm and flung him on the floor, he didn't waste any time before crouching between him and Nezuko. He felt blood dripping down his arm from when the other's nails had scraped. His mouth was still burning, his heart was beating painfully, and he felt warm all over. He didn't care. What he was concerned about was protecting Nezuko. You? The man suddenly stilled and stared at him with wide eyes. You stole my blood from me. He seemed shocked by this as he clutched his healing forearm, and the boy honestly didn't understand what he was talking about. Tanjiro was having a hard time processing what was happening either way. Growling low in his throat, He felt his muscles expand as he loomed protectively in front of his sister's unconscious form. His mind was focused solely on one goal: to protect his sister from this demon. To his apprehension, the man laughed. To become a demon of your own will, one of his descendants, no less. He seemed to be in a state of disbelief as he cradled his face. I should kill you where you stand, but I haven't had this much entertainment in ages. No, I was right. Death is too merciful. Now that you've become a demon, you will know my suffering. I will let you live, little demon. I won't kill your sister. You can take that job. He huffed out in laughter once again. What is he talking about? He wondered to himself. Is he talking about me? His eyes then shifted to his hands, his much bigger hands, the long nails making them seem like claws. His breathing stuttered before becoming erratic as he stumbled forward and away from Nezuko. These weren't the hands of a human. What have I done? All he remembered before his world went dark was one of his clawed hands reaching for his sister. When he'd woken up earlier, it was to several dead bodies surrounding him with only one person alive. He knew that she was important. All of the people here were important, but he needed to save her. But what good would these claws do? They could only ever hurt others. Maybe this was all his doing too. Carefully, he lifted up the unconscious girl in his arms. As his eyes landed on the dead people once again, he suppressed the pain that pulsed in his chest unlike any other. So he turned his back to them. He'd come back later once he'd save at least this one life. The girl repeatedly called him Onii-chan once she woke up, and so he assumed that was his name. Still, he didn't expect her to react so angrily when he'd made the choice to let himself be executed. He had no idea what he was, but he knew that he was now something that shouldn't exist in the natural order. He was abnormal through and through. Before he knew it, one of his hands had reached out to pat her on the head, as if it was the most normal thing to do when the girl was distressed in any way. Will, he tried to speak, feeling his tongue curl over the words strangely. Be okay, be fine, he reassured her. This was for the best. Besides, the swordsman didn't smell of malice. He could tell that he wouldn't harm them anymore. So why was she so angry at the older boy? In fact, all he could smell from him was the salty scent of regret and shame. For what? He didn't know, but it seemed in contrast to the way he berated the girl loudly and furiously. You'll have to kill me first to get to him, the girl was saying as she stood between them. Which was wrong. He should be the one protecting her. He didn't deserve this kindness. Though, before he could do any more than call on her attention, the older boy had made the decision for them and knocked her unconscious by chopping her on the neck once she had been effectively distracted. He caught her in his arms easily. She was so frail. He was scared. Are you? The older boy addressed him quietly as he crouched beside him. Not hungry? He tilted his head to the side in confusion. Why was he being asked this? He didn't particularly feel like eating anything. In fact, ever since he woke up, he felt like he was in a perpetual state between being too full that he could retch or too restless to even consider consuming anything. It was not a pleasant sensation, so he shook his head sharply. He combed his hand through the girl's hair as she peacefully slept with her head nestled on his lap. Earlier, she had called him her brother, and that her brother would never hurt anyone. So that meant all the people he'd carelessly left behind was his family as well. That thought brought to surface that familiar pain once again, and this time he let it flow freely. His eyes became blurred with tears. A soft keening sound escaped his lips as the tears continued to fall. Please come back, he pleaded in his mind. His heart terribly missed them. What am I going to do? I don't want to be a monster. You don't have to be, the older boy suddenly cut in. He blinked at him in surprise. Had he said that out loud? But then, scared, it was the only thing that got past his lips, and he wiped his tears in frustration at his inability to properly convey what he wanted to be understood. He should be dead. Something like him should have been dead. But, for some reason, this swordsman was now sitting beside him and not killing him. He was this girl's Onii-chan. He now understood that. But if he wanted to be heard, if it was fine for him to live. From here on out, it's gonna be hard, the swordsman told him, icy blue eyes staring at the wide expanse of snow in front of them. Apart from your sister, no one is going to accept you. You're going to be shunned. Others will fear your existence. Your sister will also get the brunt of that treatment. If her love for you is as strong as her resolve to keep you by her side, then she has nothing to worry about. You can't waver. You can't give up if you want to protect her. You have to prove yourself. That's what it means for you to live. He turned to stare at him with an expression that was mostly sad. His eyes widened. This man was telling him that it was all right for him to live, that it was fine if he wanted to. It was Tanjiro, he spoke slowly as he pointed at himself, making certain to pronounce it carefully. Ru. That was his name. He was sure of it. His heart would never lie to him. There was wonder in those blue eyes, as if this was a moment that the swordsman had never found himself in before. Jiwoo, was the eventual response. Tanjiro, Urokodaki called out to him. They had been with this old man for almost a year now. He understood that he was helping his sister get stronger. At first, he'd been incredibly worried about her, that her taste for retribution would lead her to a different path. He still remembered that time she had gone out of her way to kill that demon by the temple. The anger he'd seen there would stay with him forever. It really troubled him, that her anger would change her indefinitely. When he went to sleep, he would remember, little by little. In his dreams, the girl, Nezuko, was a soft-spoken and kind-hearted girl. To him, she was a selfless girl who always tried to put everyone else before herself. If he closed his eyes, he could easily imagine her smiling brightly at him, free from the trauma of watching her family get killed. Whatever Urokodaki had done for her, Tanjiro had smelled the shift in her emotions. Her anger had slowly dwindled into threads that would now only get taut if provoked. The burning scent of her fury had dissipated to reveal the familiar sweet fragrance of her kindness and a new fiery scent of determination. Turning to Urokodaki, he tilted his head in question. In less than a month, your sister's training with me is going to end. Urokodaki revealed to him with a sigh. She's giving it her all, and she'd come so far from that weak girl who could barely lift a sword. She's single-minded in her goal in getting stronger to protect you. He said it softly as he directed his gaze to the unfinished fox mask that sat by one of the shelves, something that he'd seen the old man work on from time to time. Is good? He asked after shifting the bamboo gag that Jiwoo had made for him. During his first few weeks with this man, he'd tried communicating through sounds and gestures since Nezuko could understand him just fine. But while Urokodaki was sharp, it took him a while to decipher what the burgundy-haired demon meant most of the time. And upon learning that Tanjiro could speak, albeit with a lot of difficulty, the man had made it his rule for Tanjiro to talk as much as possible when addressed. That way, he would get used to it once more. Even after a year, with most of his time spent sleeping, he never really got the hang of speaking fluently again. And that had greatly saddened his sister. Is it wrong of me if I don't want her to participate in the final selection? Urokodaki had asked him, voice sounding far away. Tanjiro didn't understand fully what the man was talking about, but the scent he was getting was the familiar scent of grief, something that never really strayed far from Nezuko's emotions, no matter how deep it had been buried. He didn't know who the man had lost, not when Tanjiro couldn't fully grasp the pain of what he'd lost either on that day. Sometimes he'd dreamed of their faces, basking in the presence of the people he couldn't put a name to. And when he'd wake up, the memories would slip from his fingers like sand. Sometimes, when he realized how much time had passed, he would feel the guilt clawing at him at the face of Nezuko's worry. I thought I'm going to lose you too. Her entire being screamed of this sadness when she would first see him upon waking up. Nezuko's strong, he smiled at the man. letting the admiration to bleed into his words. "You're both remarkable children." Yorokodaki's masked face turned to him slowly, contemplation lining his voice. "Remember when I told you about the first individual that became a demon?" The man suddenly questioned him. At that, Tanjiro nodded slowly. He hadn't pursued more about his circumstance, seeing as he barely remembered what had happened back then. He remembered fighting someone, transforming, but the rest of it was blurred after the sensation of being burned alive. But he'd been awake when Yorokodaki had explained to Nezuko and him that there was only one demon whose blood had the power to turn humans into demons. "As you remember, I told you that he's the Kamado family's enemy. I've suspected when I first saw your red hair and red eyes." The man continued as he turned to fully face him. "But once I saw that dance for the god of fire that Nezuko told me was passed down in your family, I think I understand. A child of the burning crimson. It's a legend long past, of the first breath that was unparalleled by any other." He stood up as he said this, slowly approaching Tanjiro. "So I'm gonna sell as much charcoal as I can." He heard his own voice echo fluently at the back of his mind. They had been a simple family of coal burners. "Maybe your existence can finally make a difference in our strife against demons." Yorokodaki crouched in front of him as he ruffled his hair. There was honestly nothing Tanjiro could say to that. "I'm happy that you've made friends with others," Nezuko remarked as they sat side by the bottom of a random tree one midnight. "But sometimes I can't help but wonder how they've easily accepted you. They know you're a demon, Onii-chan, and they don't mind you at all. I'm very relieved, but even I can remember how Yorokodaki-san didn't know how to treat you at first, citing that he had never met a demon before who didn't smell of malice." She explained to his questioning look. Of course, he forgot that Nezuko didn't have his sense of smell, while his had only become stronger upon becoming a demon, or so she claimed. She was suspicious that there was something off about their new companions, but she never did figure it out. Not yet. But Tanjiro couldn't smell their presence. The only indication for him to sense them was the lingering chill in the air. He understood, even from the very start, that they were people who didn't belong here. Not anymore. These were the very people that Yorokodaki had lost. "I like them," he spoke haltingly, voice soft. The other one reminded him deeply of Juu. They spoke in the same timbre that conveyed a hidden softness that naturally colored their voices. He wondered if Juu had learned it from this boy. When he followed him around, they didn't talk to each other that much. But when the other boy spoke, it would be reminders about helping his sister out. That it was his duty as a man to see to her safety. Tanjiro took all of those words to heart. Because all this time, he'd been floundering how to be the older brother that Nezuko needed. He didn't know how, but he was trying. "I'm sure they like you as well," Nezuko smiled at him, eyes softening. "I'll protect you, I swear on my life." In order to fulfill his promise, Tanjiro fell into one last long slumber. He had to say goodbye. This time, he dreamt of the day when their father was still alive. His mother's face was not weighed down by sorrow, and all of his siblings' faces had a glow to them from so much happiness. Here, Tanjiro was human. He was the reliable and loved older brother who looked after them, because he was the eldest child. Nezuko didn't have the calluses from training. Her eyes were bright and innocent. Her scent was not burdened by the will to fight, to shoulder all of it, and she didn't carry a shred of sadness in her smile. But this was merely a memory. His sister now was a stronger person. She had worked harder than anyone, than himself, to get where she was now, because she'd refused to let the past destroy what was left of her present. It was a concept that Tanjiro initially struggled with, because he didn't remember enough of his past to move on and stay in the present. Still, he realized that he needed to let go. "You'll be okay, Onii-chan," Nezuko told him gently, her smile softening into the present Nezuko's. "I'll always be there with you." Her voice rung with sincerity, and the finality to it made him realize that this wasn't a goodbye at all. He turned to the rest of his family. All of them were smiling at him. Of course, of course. Tanjiro? A familiar voice called out his name frantically. He whirled around in shock, having never encountered her in his dreams. Please, you've got to wake up. Urokodaki-san needs you. Please, wake up. She continued pleading as she stared at him with desperate eyes. You need to fight. A boy's words followed behind him. You've slept long enough. Looking over his shoulder, he saw the familiar figure of a peach-haired boy with a fox mask. Tanjiro finally woke up. Nezuko clenched her hands by her sides as she stared at Urokodaki intently. I learned to never ignore this feeling again when our family was killed, she told him with a determined set to her shoulders, unable to ignore the dread curling in her gut. Urokodaki-san, something bad is going to happen. Ever since I woke up this morning, this feeling wouldn't leave. She placed a hand over her chest, a heavy sensation dwelling as her intuition blared in a persistent warning. Whatever it was, it seemed to echo around her teacher's home. Urokodaki placed a hand over her head. Focus on becoming a demon slayer, the old man told her in a voice that conveyed he wouldn't accept anything but her agreement. I will take it from here. I will protect your brother. There was an unspoken promise in Urokodaki's words. Maybe I can just take the final selection next year. She started to argue, still unable to shake the thought that she might lose them, and this time she wouldn't even be there to protect her brother. If she wasn't here to protect him, what was the use of her training these past 2 years? Don't waste this chance, Urokodaki declared gently as his fingers traced the outline of the fox mask positioned above her head. You have your own battle to face. Focus. Remember what you learned. Tanjiro and I will be waiting for you. He reminded her, and she recalled that she wasn't the only one worried. Urokodaki had expressed, albeit vaguely, that he had sent out others before her to the final selection and died. It had been one of the reasons why he hadn't been initially in favor of her going. Hence, the bolder test. Her eyes widened. She sometimes forgot that Urokodaki also had an enhanced sense of smell like her brother. The man likely smelled the root of her worries. It might be because she knew that Urokodaki was strong, or because it had been a while that she knew she could rely on someone again that was not her brother. Or it might even be just the thought that she didn't have to shoulder it all on her own. But Nezuko felt that tight knot of tension in her heart loosen at those words. She was still worried, very much so. But she believed in her teacher too. Without hesitation, she surged forward and wrapped her arms around the man, around family, who had taken care of them for the past 2 years. Then please take care of Oniai-chan in my absence, she whispered under her breath. I promise I will become a demon slayer and come back. Her arms tightened around him one last time before she let go and took a step back. Earlier that morning, she had already given her farewell to her still unconscious brother. She was glad that he seemed peaceful this morning. Nezuko had been troubled last night because he'd been crying in his sleep, tears leaking out of his eyes. Her heart broke when she couldn't do anything to ease his pain. So, she had stayed by his side until his tears had subsided and he fell back into a deep slumber. I'll be on my way, she gave a low bow in a silent expression of her gratitude for his teachings. Kami-sama, please don't let harm befall my family once again. Nezuko's eyes darted towards her surroundings. There were a lot of applicants this year, and she tried not to feel intimidated or worried. Mount Fujikase apparently held demons that had been taken alive and kept captive here. Only the wisterias blooming around it, even out of season, kept them from escaping. Nezuko didn't exactly know what to feel about it. Within the mountain, those demons were apparently allowed to roam free, and the only way for them to pass was to survive there for 7 days. 7 days was too long. She had been ready to give up her chance on going to the final selection this year if it meant that she could do something about this bad feeling that wouldn't leave her. But Urokodaki had promised. She had to believe in him. What if something happens to them while I'm trapped here? She couldn't help but wonder. What if that man comes back? Her worry was getting the better of her. Her intuition blared as she stilled. The forest suddenly got quiet. The direction of the wind changed abruptly, and her body was already jumping back to dodge before her mind could fully process what she was seeing. Something landed explosively on the ground she previously stood on, and her eyes widened as she took in the male demon crouched on the cracked earth. "Oh," a sudden awed voice growled as the demon straightened. "We have a girl." "How lucky, tasty Tilda," he hummed in appreciation as he eyed her hungrily, tongue slithering out to lick his lips. Nezuko eyed him steadily as her hand went to the handle of her sword. To be honest, she was severely agitated. At the callous way he treated her life, and at the continued apprehension she felt the longer she was away from her brother's side. Her grip tightened painfully for a second before she purposely loosened it a little. Taking a deep breath, she quietly reminded herself about the purpose of her blade. She was swinging her sword to protect, so no more lives would be lost. So, this demon couldn't kill anyone else ever again, and no one would lose their family like how she and her brother did. It was the only way to go forward. She had trained for the past 2 years for this moment. "Don't ever hesitate. Remember this power you have within you," Subito's voice echoed in her mind. There was no time to doubt her ability or show hesitation now. "A girl's flesh is a lot tender than a boy's," the other shouted in glee as he surged forward to pounce on her. "Don't underestimate me just because I'm a girl," Nezuko gritted out as she took a deep, steady breath to even out her breathing as she rushed forward as well. Without hesitation, she pulled out the sword Urokodaki gave her before twisting out of the way of the demon, swinging her sword with both hands and slashing his neck and head off, before weaving around to slice his arms and legs off as well. The constant motion of the fourth form, the striking tide, gave him no time to retaliate. It was one of the forms that she favored as it focused on delivering fast, consecutive attacks that didn't require complicated footing and a lot of movement or strength. Turning around immediately just in case he was still alive, Nezuko watched as the body disintegrated into nothing. She blinked rapidly before her stunned gaze shifted to her blade. Urokodaki had told her that the Nichiren swords were the only blades capable of killing demons by cutting through their necks. It had been why that demon back in the temple 2 years ago was still alive despite how she and Tanjiro had worked together to behead him. "I did it." The relief was briefly overwhelming before she squashed it ruthlessly. She needed to focus on surviving, on returning to them. This was just the beginning. Nezuko had been so focused on worrying about leaving her brother behind in the beginning, especially with that vile sensation that came with her intuition. She wanted nothing more than for this to finally end. It was because of her overthinking, getting herself distracted in the process, that it hadn't occurred to her immediately to head for east, where the sunlight would no doubt hit first. Quietly calculating where her feet had taken her, she must have gone the opposite direction. "Stupid," she berated herself harshly, already imagining the insult Subito would unleash on her for this lapse of concentration. Thinking about Subito dampened her mood quite a bit. Hands on the hilt of her sword at all times, Nezuko carefully navigated the forest that encompassed the mountain. She had encountered some demons earlier who had enjoyed trying to goad her into losing her composure, but training with Urokodaki, who always struck where it hurt the most, had instilled strength in her to keep her emotions under control. Somewhat. At least, until someone threatened her brother. "Hey you," someone yelled from above her. "Fight me." Nezuko pulled her sword out of its sheath as her red eyes landed on a peculiar being. Instead of the raging visage of a demon, her gaze connected with the dull cerulean eyes of a boarhead. For a moment, she was quite stupefied. Her intuition was telling her that he wasn't a disfigured demon with an animal head. The jagged blades of his dual swords were even more alarming, but otherwise, he didn't give her the foreboding impression that usually warned her about demons. Either this was a human or she'd finally met. "Hey, don't ignore me," he continued hollering at her as he jumped down from the branch he'd been standing on. "I'm talking to you. I said fight me." His grip on the bandaged hilts of his swords tightened, obviously preparing to attack. "Are you here to become a demon slayer?" Nezuko questioned him intently, not letting her guard down. So what? He indirectly answered before pressing forward to attack her. Her eyes widened as she hastily blocked his attack by the flat side of her blade. She couldn't help but stare at the uneven and jagged edge of his swords, knowing that if he managed to slice her with those blades, it would be certainly painful and bloody. Besides, what the hell was this bastard thinking? They were isolated in a mountain, tasked to fight and survive against demons, and he was attacking her instead. "Knock it off! Do you want to die?" she screamed at him in a fit of frustration. They were in danger here. "Are you threatening me?" he growled angrily, misunderstanding her words and completely missing the point. Spinning on her heel, she let the force of his swing to glide down her blade before clenching her other hand into a fist to punch and knock some sense into him. She wasn't surprised when he leaned back from her assault, but she'd been expecting it as she flicked her sword, the edge catching onto the cavity left by the jagged edges of his blades, surprising him off guard as his weapons became stuck to hers. She didn't waste any second before she lashed out with a spinning kick towards his torso. To her utter shock, he let go of his swords in order to bend completely backwards to avoid her attack, and proceeded to kick her on the hip as he used his hands to push him forward for a low hit. She staggered backwards from the unexpected blow before she grabbed him by the ankle and quite literally tossing him to the side. He didn't get far, seeing as she didn't have the momentum to throw him farther. He flipped in the air and swiftly landed on his feet. Fine, I'll fight you," Nezuko growled as she straightened, his swords clattering on the ground. "But only after we finish this exam and defeat some demons. Do you hear me?" She glared at him for all she was worth, feeling the vestiges of her temper slipping out of her control. To be honest, at a critical time like this, if the only way she could force a compromise out of this was to agree to his stupid demand, then so be it. There were a lot of stakes here. Her older brother was waiting for her. Urokodaki was expecting her to stay alive and return to them. Her family might be in danger. All she wanted was to get this selection over with. For that, she needed to survive. If this guy wouldn't stop. However, her vision slowly started to bleed red. She blinked when he shifted on his feet. It was hard to tell what expression he was making with that boar head, but it almost seemed like he was fidgeting. "Fine," he eventually answered gruffly. "We'll kill demons first before we have our fight down this mountain," he declared as he pointed a finger at her challengingly. Wait, did this guy lost his sense of self-preservation? That was saying if they even still have the energy to stand by the end of all this. She stared at him blankly. That wasn't what she meant, not at all, not quite literally after the exam. A loud growl cut through their conversation. Her brows furrowed. That wasn't the sound of an angry demon. It was a lot reminiscent to the sound that Shijuru's stomach made when their mother was in the middle of making dinner. As if to confirm her suspicions, there was another growl as the boy stood frozen across from her. "I'm hungry," he abruptly declared as he started rummaging through a random bush. An idea popped into her head. "I have onigiri," Nezuko offered, trying not to sound too hopeful. His name was Hashibira Inasuke. He was human and had a boar head covering his strangely pretty face. While she had managed to consume one rice ball, he'd eaten the rest of her 3 portions as well. Nezuko tried not to cry as she lamented that she would now finally have to scavenge around the mountain for some food. Maybe she would find a river with fishes. It had been a last-minute decision to pack some food with her, because if Urokodaki's training taught her anything, it was always a good idea to have food on her to keep her energy up when fighting or training. Though, she figured that it was fine. She had convinced the other to stop his incessant demands to fight her. Of course, the promise of food always worked. It was a tactic that she and Tanjiro often employed on their younger siblings. "Why do you want to fight me anyway?" she asked him curiously, the annoyance now fading away to give way for excitement that she had finally met a fellow demon slayer applicant. So far since she'd been on this mountain, she hadn't met another, which was odd, considering their sheer number upon entering this place. I saw how you defeated those demons earlier, he grumbled as he stared at her suspiciously. You're strong. Your form and blade are different from most of the others here. And you sensed me following you. His voice was accusing as he said this. Ah, so that's the confusing vibe I was getting earlier, she said in realization, surprised. It was true. When she had been moving about this mountain and fighting demons, she had the distinct feeling of someone watching her. She had attributed it to the demons, but after clashing with some of them and her intuition did not sense the malice that usually accompanied their presence, she had tried to pinpoint it to no avail since it kept moving. As if that someone had been observing from somewhere far away, and since she couldn't afford to waste energy on going after something that had no ill intentions, she left it alone. You couldn't tell because I'm so great, Inosuke laughed rather obnoxiously, expression smug. You can't best me in the mountains. I can tell even from here where the others are. He crossed his arms over his chest proudly. That sounds amazing, she complimented sincerely, wondering if her brother could emulate that same enhanced sense. Oh, of course it is. The other spluttered and stumbled over his words, staring at her with glazed eyes. Though, something about what he said caught her attention. You can tell where the others are? She leaned forward as she stared at him intently as he nodded cautiously at her sudden focus. I haven't encountered anyone since I got here, except for you. Maybe we can all survive this thing if we work together, she told him about her goal, apprehensive that other people might be dying in this exam as well. She knew that Urokodaki had told her to focus on surviving, but if she could protect other people along the way, then it would ease her heart. For the next 5 days, Nezuko traversed Mount Fujikasen as she followed after Inosuke. She had let him take the lead in pointing out possible locations of the other applicants while she kept an extra eye out. Thankfully, they found a stream near the top of the mountain, and they hadn't wasted any time catching themselves some fish. While they had managed to help 2 others out who were almost devoured by demons, they had also found some human remains scattered throughout the mountain. Nezuko tried to keep it together at those sites and not let the memory of her family's death overwhelm her. Inosuke seemed to be in his element in this setting, but he had the habit of always charging into danger rather recklessly, and it honestly gave Nezuko a headache every time she had to run after him to make sure that he stayed alive. She had half a mind to leave him to his devices, but by the time she had chosen somewhere to go, she could already hear him hollering after her for leaving him behind. Too much enthusiasm right there. It reminded her of her younger siblings that it hurt, sometimes, but she was grateful for the company. Come on, Setsuko, we're going that way. There's a couple of brats in that direction fighting some demons. He pointed imperiously at the direction going down the mountain, still unable to get her name right after all this time. It's Nezuko, she absent-mindedly reminded him as an uneasy feeling made itself known, putting her on her guard. Inosuke, go there first. Make sure that nobody dies there, got it? And under no circumstances are you allowed to die, so be careful. She reminded him with a glare. Who the hell are you taking me for? Inosuke yelled in complaint as he pulled out his jagged swords. And don't tell me what to do. I'll protect those punks and kill more demons than you. He shouted indignantly before surging forward to do as she said. She had to wonder when his challenges to fight her had changed to who could kill the most demons. She kind of wished that she had his straightforward way of thinking, while she couldn't shake the unnerving feeling that her brother could have easily turned out like these demons she was killing. Inosuke must have sensed that something wasn't quite right, and Nezuko expected more resistance, to be honest. But with the way he took everything as a challenge, it really shouldn't have surprised her. A scream cut through the air, and her head snapped to its direction. Without hesitation, Nezuko immediately ran towards the sound. The stench of death was so familiar, it was sickening. Don't ever hesitate, Subito's voice grounded her as her trembling lessened. Then fight so you wouldn't lose anyone ever again. Tanjiro's voice put her fears to rest as she steeled herself. Gripping the hilt of her sword with both hands, she ran towards him, breathing through her mouth. Focus on your breaths, she reminded herself as calmly as she could. Don't fight the flow, look at his movements, trust your intuition, always put strength into your attacks. She recounted Urikodaki's reminders, before she shot up and sliced 2 of the demon's arms with the consecutive slashes of the 4th form, striking tide. She skidded on the ground roughly after her assault. If her battles with Sabito taught her anything, it was that if one started to attack, there should be no room for the other party to retaliate. So, she immediately surged forward again, eyes already roaming its massive body of entangled arms to pinpoint the neck. Though, her intuition blared loudly in warning before letting her body simply follow it as she leaned back in free fall and watched as a long massive arm shot out from one of its appendages, almost hitting her. He could apparently produce more arms and hands that weren't already present. Good to know as she rolled on the ground to catch herself. She further jumped backwards to put more distance between them. That was almost reckless of her, she knew, but her surprise attack had been a once-in-a-lifetime chance that she hadn't wanted to waste. Slitted amber eyes honed on her immediately. That mask, the demon rumbled as his eyes gleamed menacingly. So, another sweet little fox has come to me. I was starting to wonder these past few days if Urokodaki finally gave up on having students. He giggled into his many hands, eyes curving gleefully. What are you talking about? How do you even know Urokodaki-san? She demanded lowly, deliberately not touching the fox mask placed above her head. Of course, I know him. He's the one who put me in this prison after all. He snarled as his limbs seemed to twist and tangle even more around him in his agitation. Tell me, girl, what is the year of Meiji now? The demon asked almost pleasantly. Her intuition blared in warning as she sensed his bloodlust subtly heightening with his question. Does it matter what era it is now? She quietly returned with a question, feeling sweat trickling down the back of her neck. Of course, it does, you damn brat. He roared furiously as all his hands flailed and scratched in anger, the ground shaking at his outburst. She pressed her mouth into a thin line as she watched the demon went into an apoplectic explosion. Damn that Urokodaki. Damn him. While he keeps sending more brats here, I'm always held prisoner in this godforsaken place. Utterly unforgivable. I'll kill every single one of you. He snarled as some of his hands clawed on the ground. Nezuko kept getting a bad feeling about this demon. This demon had a grudge against her teacher. Just how long had he been imprisoned here? From his words, it sounded like he had been kept here for years, which didn't make any sense because one of those applicants she and Inosuke had saved had confided in them that they had underestimated the demons in this mountain, seeing as those held here were supposed to be weak. Still, she knew that the demon-slaying core had no reason to lie, so it meant that this was just a different brand of monster. Going over what he said, Nezuko stiffened in understanding. You recognized my mask, she mumbled in wonder as the picture slowly started to piece itself. These are only given to Urokodaki-san's students. She murmured in disbelief at what she was saying because that meant. Because she was now realizing that Sabito and Makomo were killed by him. It made a sickening amount of sense. She had known who they were. For a while. It just didn't mean that it hurt any less. There are those too who stood out. However, the demon continued, obviously relishing on the despair his words were bringing her. Shut up, Nezuko yelled as she tried to calm her breathing, her hands squeezing the hilt of her sword painfully. Emotions are powerful. Urokodaki's voice from more than a year ago rang within her. Don't let others use yours against you. There is always time to be angry, to grieve, to be happy. Keep your heart steady. Keep it calm and gentle. Be like the water, Nezuko, and never waver. Of course, this was going to be a testament of her heart's strength. Her anger was overpowering, but this was not the time. Her intuition blared again, and she jumped backwards as arms shot out from the ground she previously stood on. Concentrating on her breathing, she lashed out and slashed the arms off before surging forward to attack once again. Other hands reached out to grab her, but she hacked and sliced, single-minded on her goal, running and weaving around the attacks using the footwork of the third form. The arms kept regenerating back so quickly though. She knew that no matter how many arms she sliced off that they would just grow back. "You can't defeat me by just cutting off my arms," the demon told her delightedly, enjoying her plight. "Then again, even that peach-haired brat couldn't slice off my head." His voice lowered ominously. She froze. He's talking about Sabito. Another pair of arms formed and rushed forward to swat her away. Her intuition was deafening. "Asako, don't you dare die right now!" Inosuke's loud voice suddenly cut in angrily from somewhere behind her. Thinking quickly, she met the attack with a stab of her sword. Flipping over it using her weapon, she wasted no time running towards the demon's head. She couldn't afford to die. She wouldn't let anyone else die by this demon's power. She would go back to Tanjiro. She would protect him. She swore on her life. It was for a moment, but she saw it. The panic that reflected in his eyes. The way his attacks got reckless and more straightforward as he seemed to send all of his arms to stop her. Swinging her sword as she ran forward, she remembered Sabito's words. "Remember this power you have within you," he'd said that day as she successfully sliced that boulder. Nezuko tried to remember what she did, what she was capable of. Settling her grip on her sword, she took a deep breath and ran faster. She needed to swing not only with her arm, but with her whole being. All of her energy concentrated on the edge of her blade in a powerful concentrated slash. And cleanly sliced his head off. "Man, Madoka, you're really strong. You have to fight me." Inosuke gestured wildly once he reached her standing over the disintegrating demon's head. "It's Nezuko," she sighed tiredly, feeling entirely drained, before looking at the demon once again. It was only for a moment, but as his head fell, one of his hands had reached out. "Niai-chan," he'd called out quietly, eyes unseeing. For a moment, her mind conjured up an image of her older brother, his head and body disintegrating the same way this demon's did, calling out for his younger sister, for her. Against her will, tears welled up in her eyes as she touched that large hand, easily seeing how Tanjiro could have been in this demon's place. "I can't forgive you," she murmured under her breath as she remembered the smiling faces of Sabito and Makomo, of Urokodaki's desire not to send her here. "But I hope you see your brother again." With that, she abruptly let go as if burned before hastily wiping her eyes. "That demon's crying," Inosuke commented in confusion. Of course, he was. Nezuko turned to her impromptu partner for this selection and gave him a small, warm smile. Apparently, Inosuke got held up a while ago because there were surprisingly a lot of demons that the others were fighting off. "Thank you, Inosuke, for calling out to me like that," she stated lightly, recalling how his voice had brought her back to the battle. "And for preventing his other limbs from getting to me when I delivered that final blow. I'm glad you were there." She meant every word, as this crazy little rascal really did save her life. To her confusion, he just remained staring at her, entire posture screaming amazement. She could see some of the applicants that she and Inosuke had ran into. Compared to the large number of people at the start of this test, Nezuko felt disheartened that there were only 9 of them who made it out. 2 of them were the ones they had saved earlier, while the rest were unknown. Though 4 of them appeared to be worse for wear and 2 of them seemed to be in immediate need of medical attention judging by the blood-soaked bandages she could glimpse. Earlier, she had punched a rather rude ruffian who'd manhandled one of the children running the selection process. After that, she hadn't thought twice about choosing an oar before just picking up the first thing that felt right with her intuition. She knew that she surprised the other applicants with how abrupt she had been, but she really needed to get home. She wouldn't be able to rest as long as she didn't see her brother or Urokodaki alive. "Oi, wait for me. You owe me a fight, you know," she heard Inosuke's voice yelling after her as she descended the mountain. To be honest, he could have gone ahead of her since he didn't seem particularly interested in getting a new pair of swords or even just the uniform. After giving her size to the one in charge, seeing as she repaired her clothes all the time even back then, She started to make a beeline back for Mount Sajiri. It was like feeding a cat and having that same cat follow her home for more food or company. She wasn't sure, but Inosuke really reminded her of a stray cat. She wasn't even sure anymore why she was just letting him. Though, her stomach further twisted in anxiety at the reminder that she needed to get back home. It only seemed to get worse as her widened eyes met the familiar blue eyes of someone waiting for her at the foot of Mount Fujikasen. She heard Inosuke go quiet behind her. He must have sensed that something was amiss as well. "Tomioka-san," she breathed out. Urokodaki calmly unsheathed his sword as he stood across from this demon. It was apparent that this demon was in an entirely different league from all the others he'd fought before. His stench was overwhelming, a lot of blood on his hands, and not to mention, this was the same stench that he'd been getting a glimpse of near the mountains and around town. He'd already done his best to send Nezuko away, and Tanjiro was tucked safely away from harm. "I won't let you harm those children," he declared matter-of-factly. "I don't care about the girl, and just give me the demon," the pale man stated, a calm smile on his lips. "And maybe I'll give you a swift death, old man." His smile widened into a grin, the kanji carved into his eyes glowing menacingly. When Tanjiro opened his eyes, he expected to see the dark wooden ceiling of Urokodaki's home. Instead, he found himself faced with deformed walls with him propped against it and covered in a blanket. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust and the smell of earth and wood to register in his mind. For a while, he wondered why he was here. He didn't know how long he'd slept this time, and he instantly felt guilty that he'd worried Nezuko again. But it was different this time because he'd promised to let go. That he needed to be in the present. Taking off the blanket, he padded around this incredibly small space on his hands and knees before moving for the exit where traces of moonlight shone through. Crawling out of that tiny cave as his clawed hands swiped away large tangles of leaves, Tanjiro realized that he'd been sleeping inside the base of a tree, and the walls earlier were actually the mass of roots intertwined and overlapping each other. The entrance had been covered by foliage, and he realized that whoever had placed him here had intended to hide him. Suddenly, he froze as a familiar voice from his dream reverberated through him once again. "Urokodaki-san needs you." The flower girl's desperate plea felt like ice coursing through his veins. That while he didn't remember the dream in its entirety, he could now recall hearing voices imploring him to wake up. He recoiled as a pungent smell reached his senses, scrambling to cover his nose with trembling hands. What is this? This scent, for some reason, bothered him beyond belief. It was the smell of blood, the smell of carnage, the smell that wasn't human. Suddenly, there was a loud explosion behind him, and he could feel the tremors even from where he was slumped. Slowly, he pushed himself to stand up. No matter how much he tried to settle down, his nerves were on edge and he was breathing rather heavily. It wasn't until a loud creaking sound started emanating from the bamboo muzzle in his mouth that he realized that he was trying to grit his teeth, biting harder than he was supposed to. Looking at the moon above, he could safely assume from numerous nights having it as his constant company that it was a few hours before dawn. He squashed that instinctual fear that usually surged through him at the thought of the sunlight touching and incinerating his skin once more. While it always saddened him that he could only stay behind within the safety of Urokodaki's home during the day, Tanjiro knew on a subconscious level that if he let the sun come into contact with him directly, he could really lose his life. The ground he stood on shook once more before the burgundy-haired demon leapt from the ground and dashed towards its source. His face tightened in that familiar way when he'd fought that demon back at the temple years ago, while his claw-like hands flexed and clenched, restless and taut as he urged his limbs to go faster. The closer he got, the stronger that pungent scent got. The nearer he was, the smell of Urokodaki's blood and pain finally reached him. A low rumble started from his chest before he found himself loudly growling. The moment he burst into the clearing, Tanjiro only had eyes for Urokodaki. To his relief, the man was still alive. though that feeling was short-lived when he saw him wheezing, his clothes drenched in blood, leaning heavily on his sword that was stabbed on the ground while blood continued to drip in alarming quantities from the bottom of his mask. His own blood felt hot under his skin as his slitted eyes shifted to the back of his enemy. That bitter scent was stronger than ever, and it was now clear to him why this unknown angered him just by existing. 1, 2, 3, thump. Loud. His heartbeat. Warm. Unreasonably so. The memory of blood would always stay with him, because he had no choice. That was his first memory of waking, to the dead bodies of people who were important to him. While he could barely recall the way they smiled, the way they laughed, the way they lived. For a moment, a red haze overcame him. The smell was so intense. Death is too merciful. That man had told him, he remembered now. I guess all that resistance is wasted, the pink-haired man finally remarked as he stared at Tanjiro over his shoulder, golden eyes gleaming under the moonlight. Upper Moon 3, his eyes said. I gotta say, those traps around this mountain are extremely annoying. For someone so old, it's surprising that you lasted this long. The way he said those things, regardless of his words, were clearly mocking, clearly indicating that this was only possible because he'd allowed it to happen. Our run, Urokodaki rasped out quietly that Tanjiro almost didn't hear him. His vision blurred with tears, and he shook his head sharply. It was Jiwoo who'd given him the means to live. This man had taken them in when they had nowhere else to go. This man had taken care of Nezuko when Tanjiro couldn't, who taught her to be strong, to fight, who treated Tanjiro not as a demon, but as someone and who had clearly been ready to sacrifice his life for him and Nezuko. He could tell from how faint her scent was that she wasn't anywhere near here, which was a relief. I knew you had your use, the unknown grinned as he turned fully to face Tanjiro. It gave this brat something to come back for. He said it so matter-of-factly, as if he didn't expect any less. As if knowing that Tanjiro would only come to him personally as long as Urokodaki was still alive. That thought only served to fuel his anger, his blood searing. Underneath all that scorching fury was the sickly sweet taste of guilt. He didn't even know this man, but he'd made it clear that the burgundy-haired demon was his goal. His chest tightened painfully, the confusing mess of emotions threatening to swallow him whole. Time's up, the man suddenly declared as he appeared within Tanjiro's personal space in a blink of an eye. He jerked back in shock as he instinctively tried to claw the other's face, only for the other to catch his wrist and throw him far and hard against a cluster of trees. He gasped as his back took the brunt of the damage, dust cloud obscuring his vision. He coughed, tasting iron in his mouth. Gingerly picking himself up from the wreckage, he quietly marveled to himself that his opponent was fast, was out of his league. The pressure from him alone was overwhelming. Picking up the oncoming scent, Tanjiro wasted no time and leapt back from the attack, watching as the man stood up from the crater he made when he'd punched the ground with his fist. He was staring intently at Tanjiro, eyes narrowing. While it initially hurt to breathe, slowly, with each breath he took, it became easier. Calm down, calm down, calm down. Tanjiro repeated to himself as he gave this man his whole focus. The man was fast, he was stronger, and he knew it. But earlier, it might not have meant anything, but he'd seen the attack coming. Not quite right. He'd smelled the bloodlust, the shift in the air, and he'd dodged. Nezuko had told him that as a human, his sense of smell had always been powerful. As a demon, how far could he exactly take it? Right now, it might just be the only thing that could help him fight. You know what I hate more than weak, pathetic humans? The man straightened from his attack, the air vibrating around him. Weak, useless demons. Even that old man had put up a better fight than you. He sounded sincerely disappointed, a bit disgusted. Then, the air shifted once again and Tanjiro prepared to defend. Only, the man didn't move from where he was standing and had bent as he punched forward rapidly with both arms. Regardless of distance, the scent of smoldering air reached his nose, and he jumped back as the charred smell grew stronger. However, he had to keep moving as the shockwave of the attack rapidly dispersed, grazing his forearms that he'd crossed in front to protect himself. He roughly landed a few feet away, feeling the cuts sluggishly bleeding. This demon, from his scent alone, was evidently unlike the others. He didn't simply reek of blood and death. This man smelled like power. Not to mention, he smelled like him. Tanjiro's breathing got heavier again as that familiar red haze filled his vision. Hadn't been those deaths enough? It was maddening, the swirl of anger and sorrow and confusion, and he didn't know how to let go of it all. "Is that all you got after all?" was the nonchalant taunt of the other. The calluses on Nezuko's hands, too rough and hardened for a girl. Red continued to fill his vision. Urokodaki carving a fox mask with such care. This terrible anger, it scared him. Because he didn't want to stray far from who he was. He wanted to be that person again. Wanted more than anything to remain who he was, regardless of what his mind remembered. What his mind told him to. His heart was heavy. But this man, this demon, he was going to take something away from him again. Just the thought of it, the torrent of anger was restless. Unstoppable. That's what it means for you to live. Without any prompt, Tanjiro found himself surging forward this time. He had aimed for a low spinning kick, which was easily dodged as the other jumped, before he followed after him with a punch. Not to his surprise, his fist was expertly caught in one hand. Growling lowly in his throat, he pulled his head back and smashed it against the demon's head. Apparently, with enough force to send the other back a couple of meters through the foliage. His heartbeat was fast and loud in his ears. This was far from over. "Say, what's your name?" The demon's voice echoed through the dust cloud that had built up from where he was thrown. "I can tell that you're a newborn demon, possibly for a year or two. Still, you're obviously stronger than the average ones, and this is when you still haven't even developed your own techniques yet." The smoke had cleared out to reveal the relatively unscathed demon, previous expression of contempt now shifting to one of curiosity. Tanjiro's only answer was a snarl, eyes narrowing into furious slits. "No, scratch that." There was a laugh as he grinned in disbelief. "Can you even talk?" Before Tanjiro could react, the other was already a step away from him in the span of a heartbeat, a punch aimed for his head. He shifted to the side as that familiar smell of smoldering air reached his senses once again, barely evading the assault. Still, it was strong enough that a large cut had sliced through his cheek. There. Another one. This time from his right as the man brought up his leg to knee him. He caught it with one of his hands as he tried to make a powerful swipe for his exposed torso. Though, it was too late when he'd noticed the scent of displaced air, for he was too close, before he was sent spiraling away towards a cluster of rocks. He groaned as he gingerly held his right shoulder, which was profusely bleeding from a large gash that extended to his side. This now confirmed what he saw earlier. Attacks could still reach him when the other fired into empty air with his fists or legs. Hastily standing up, he stumbled and jumped about as the other punched forward once again, creating a large and much noticeable shockwave this time. Without thinking about it, Tanjiro threw himself to his far left on the ground, careful not to jostle his shoulder. Though, what greeted him instead was a strong foot to his stomach that sent his body skipping on the ground a few feet away. This guy was fast. Tanjiro could barely see him move. As he struggled to push himself up with his hands, he found himself coughing out blood, and it didn't seem to be stopping any time soon as he fought the urge to curl up in pain. His insides were burning. His shoulder and side were throbbing something fierce. He couldn't remember a time, even before, when he'd been in this so much pain. "I'm sorry, Nezuko." A human's body severely limits them from continuing on. It can't withstand continuous punishment. They'll eventually grow old and die. The man told him, his footsteps eerily silent as they appeared within Tanjiro's periphery. "But us demons? This kind of thing can be cured in a blink of an eye. It could barely even scratch us. That old man's attacks that had slashed me earlier have already healed. But look at you. Your wounds are barely healing." He sounded extremely displeased by this as he crouched down in front of Tanjiro. He focused on getting his breathing to calm down, feeling the pain in each wound and damage pounding in tandem with his heartbeat. Though, he jerked in surprise when the bamboo muzzle in his mouth was roughly pulled away from him. Tanjiro gritted his teeth as the demon carelessly tossed it somewhere behind him. "That thing's in the way." The demon lips curled in disgust. "I'm a Kaza. From the looks of it, these humans have tamed you well. Judging by your weak form and equally pathetic constitution, I'd go far as to say that you haven't eaten any human since you were turned." His eyes flashed ominously, and something in his scent was fluctuating wildly, a mix of anger, a little bit of curiosity, and a surprising amount of pity. He kept quiet, refusing to utter a word in his presence. Tanjiro let out a surprised cry as he was violently hauled to his feet by a Kaza pulling on his hair without care. He didn't know where the pink-haired demon was bringing him, but he struggled with all his might. It didn't matter if it jostled his still throbbing shoulder. He was at the point when he was contemplating on simply biting him when he was haphazardly tossed on the ground. He blinked in confusion before his burgundy eyes landed on Urokodaki's slumped form. If it weren't for the faint wheezes and the scent of pain continuously emitting from him, Tanjiro would have assumed the worst already. Though, terror washed over him as his eyes shifted back to Akaza. "Since this old man is gonna die anyway, why don't you start with him?" His golden eyes were fixated on Urokodaki as he stepped towards him with purpose. For a moment, his words only served to confuse Tanjiro before his whole form trembled as he understood what the older demon was getting at. 1, 2, 3 steps, and he was getting closer. Tanjiro stumbled to his feet as dread unceasingly coursed through him. Akaza pulled his arm back, his hand outstretched. He was going to kill Urokodaki. The burgundy-haired demon could smell the intent from him, could glean the finality in his stance. His heartbeat was getting faster. He needed to make it on time as Akaza surged forward. "Stop!" Tanjiro yelled desperately, voice guttural, as he dashed forwards. It was like his body had a mind of its own. Because it had all been a blur, he was so helpless. To his despair, it wasn't a new feeling. It was so familiar. Tanjiro just wanted to set things right. He couldn't bear the thought of watching anyone important to him dying in front of him. He thought of Nezuko, her smile, and his promise that he would protect her. If he couldn't even save Urokodaki, what was the use? "You are a gentle child," Urokodaki had told him once as he watched Tanjiro quietly laying an unconscious Nezuko on a futon who had pushed herself to her limits once again. Tanjiro remembered how those words had made him feel, how it had brought him to tears. If he could just protect. He couldn't help but wonder numbly as he stared the pale arm buried in his chest. His vision swam as he tilted his head up to stare at Akaza's surprised visage. The intense pain slowly blooming was nothing as he stared over his shoulder, seeing how the tip of those pale fingers didn't even get to graze a frozen Urokodaki who was unscathed by the attack. Blood continued to spill out of his mouth as he coughed weakly. He made it. Tanjiro fell on the ground as Akaza roughly pulled out his arm from his chest, staring at him with something akin to appalled wonder. Tears streamed down his eyes as the pain became intense. He needed to stand up again, they still weren't safe. "I gave you the chance to get stronger and properly fight back for your life," Akaza's words were foreboding, stated so blankly. "And what do? You waste that chance to continue to try and sacrifice yours for one measly weak, old human." The air around him was vibrating once again, the acrid scent of his fury overwhelming Tanjiro's panic. "Do not underestimate that boy," Urokodaki spat angrily. "Words of an old man who's about to die," Akaza bit back, looking visibly irked. "If you had just given me this fucking demon in the first place, then maybe I could have just given you a swift death. I gave you your chance in the beginning. What part of this demon is not to underestimate? His emotions seemed to waver again, and Tanjiro wondered, from Akaza's scent, what was it about Urokodaki that was rubbing the other the wrong way? Tanjiro winced as Akaza suddenly grabbed him by the arm before proceeding to kick it by the elbow, cleanly breaking it. "Gaheg!" he screamed out in pain, squirming in the older demon's grasp, as he screamed and choked in his own blood. Maybe Urokodaki might have shouted something, but everything was now a blur through the haze of pain. Tanjiro shrieked as a foot stepped on his thigh this time, breaking his femur. He might have been wailing, he wasn't sure, but his throat hurt so much, his own voice drowning out the noise and scents around him. "Dear mother, please stop this. I want it to stop." Akaza was saying something, but he couldn't register it, his ears ringing viciously. He could feel his muscles and tissues already shifting, his body trying to heal what it could. The pain didn't immediately lessen though, and all he could do at this point was scream. It was easy to give in to the dark oblivion. It was so tempting. But Urokodaki. Hissing through his teeth, he bit through his tongue as a sword was suddenly stabbed through his collarbone, burying it hilt deep and through the ground beneath him. He quietly braced himself for what was coming next. But it didn't come. Tanjiro was wondering if he was hallucinating the severed pale arm in front of his face, because that would mean, "You've overstayed your welcome." An achingly familiar voice cut through the haze, and the burgundy-haired demon weakly shifted his head to stare at the newcomer standing protectively in front of them. His world mercifully went dark. His eyes snapped open as a tremor shook the ground. He tried to stand up, but found that he couldn't as he was trapped by the sword still stabbed through him. Trying to pull it out, Tanjiro weakly grunted as it barely budged. Though, he blinked as he realized that he could move his arm. There was no hole in his chest, and his other injuries were already halfway healed. Though, the residual ache told him that earlier hadn't been a dream. Shaking his head to rid of those thoughts, his gaze landed on the now unconscious form of Urokodaki. Tanjiro was extremely worried. The man's injuries had already gone long enough without being treated. Judging by the shallow and irregular breaths he could barely hear, it was only a matter of time before he fully succumbed to his injuries. It was not a pleasant thought. What was the last thing he remembered? Aside from the overwhelming pain. Jiwoo. He exhaled sharply in surprise as he tried to sit up, to no avail, to look for the older man. There was no mistaking this scent. Akaza's pungent scent was still permeating his surroundings, and Tanjiro could only wonder just how strong the other demon was if he still remained undefeated. However, his eyes shifted towards the sky and his worries shifted priorities. It was starting to lighten up, and it was only a few minutes before the first rays of sunlight started to shine down here. Squirming more than ever and careful not to aggravate and worsen the stab, Tanjiro desperately pulled on the sword. It didn't matter if he sliced his palms open on the edge of the blade. He just needed to get off this thing and hide. He couldn't afford to die right now. Not yet. Growling loudly, he heaved himself up as he slowly, but surely, pulled out the sword. Tanjiro gasped for breath as he succeeded, letting the weapon to clatter on the ground before he hastily scrambled to his feet. Gently lifting Urokodaki in his arms, he was careful not to unsettle the man too much as he limped towards the smell of home. The sound of battle had died down, and Tanjiro wondered if Akaza had retreated for the same reason as he was doing right now, refusing to acknowledge the alternative. He bit back a screech as he felt his face and arms burning, scorching, as what little light from the dawn had managed to reach him. Plowing through the wreckage of Urokodaki's door and making sure that he absorbed the fall, he promptly bit his forearm and screamed. This was absolutely different from that time he'd carried Nezuko when she'd collapsed. Back then, he had his scarf and blanket to cover as much as he could. Even indirect, sunlight was painful back then. Right now, it was excruciating. After what seemed like hours, Tanjiro panted, tears leaking from his eyes as he sluggishly blinked to eye his singed hands. For a moment, all he focused on was calming down. He didn't know what happened after he passed out, But he needed to get Jiwoo. They needed to take Urokodaki to a doctor. His heartbeat was faint and weak, and Tanjiro couldn't afford to waste a single second. Though, he eyed the bright world outside of Urokodaki's house. Was he willing to risk it? He found Tomioka Jiwoo unconscious near the stream of Sajiri Mountain. The other's back was bleeding, and he had a cloth tying the handle of his broken sword to his hand. Tanjiro didn't try to unravel it and cautiously approached him. The other didn't wake even when Tanjiro carefully hoisted him on his back. Though it should worry him, Jiwoo was alive, and that was all that mattered. It saddened him that after all this time, they couldn't even meet properly under these circumstances. There was no trace of Nezuko within the vicinity, so Tanjiro had to trust that Urokodaki had made the right decision. If he remembered it right, she was either on the final selection to become a slayer, or she'd already become one and was going on missions. He couldn't help but wonder what Akaza's real goal was, because, miraculously enough, they were all alive. He was wearing the Tengu mask Urokodaki had given him last year, while he had covered his head underneath with cloth in addition to the blue scarf wrapped around him. He'd ripped out the bottom half of his haori in order to cover his burnt hands and arms and wrap what he could of Urokodaki's wounds to stop the bleeding. Tanjiro could do this. He could save them. And yet, the sunlight was pure torture. Tanjiro could feel the uncomfortable warmth indirectly through the fabric, and while it no longer outright burned him, he felt slightly weaker, and the wounds from earlier, which were still on their way to healing, throbbed unpleasantly. Urokodaki-san, Jiwoo-san, please wait a little longer. He thought determinedly as he trekked down the mountain as quickly as he could with Jiwoo on his back and Urokodaki in his arms. It was an arduous process, but he couldn't give up. Earlier, he'd been at a loss on where to go, but a crow had screeched in his face to follow it. It was Jiwoo's crow, and it told him that reinforcements were on their way. While that should have relieved Tanjiro, there was an underlying amount of apprehension as well. Because reinforcements meant other demon slayers, and he was still a demon. Thankfully, it was still very early and without a lot of people around, because he didn't know if he could explain why he was carrying 2 injured men as he painstakingly traversed the roads. His breath came in gasps, his chest pulsating painfully with each breath he took. It felt like a long time before the wind suddenly changed direction, and the sound of running reached his ears. Tanjiro paused in the middle of the road as several people dressed in dark uniforms surrounded him. He couldn't help but grow tense when they all unsheathed their swords. Now was not the time to fight, so he quietly went down to his knees in a sign of surrender. Though, his head snapped up when they parted to let someone pass through. His slitted burgundy orbs met the dual-colored eyes of the person which were staring him down. Tanjiro caught the faintest whiff of distaste from him, but otherwise had no intent to kill. TCH, to think that one of the pillars is reduced to this. Nezuko gasped as she eyed the bandages wrapped around Tomioka's head and the way his right arm was wrapped in a sling. "What happened to you?" she screamed in distress as she trotted towards him quickly, regardless of her fatigue. "You need to come with me," Tomioka merely said bluntly. She recoiled in confusion. Her intuition was blaring once again as her shoulders trembled, wondering if this had anything to do with the bad feeling that she had before she left for Mount Fujikasen. It was even weird talking to him like this after all these years that he'd left all her letters without a single reply. She'd often pondered if he was receiving them until Urokodaki had been quick to reassure her. "Who the hell are you?" Inosuke demanded from her side brusquely, hands going to the handle of his swords. Nezuko anxiously hovered, trying to find the right words to explain. "Ah," a cheerful voice cut in, making her and Inosuke jump. "You must be Kamado Nezuko-chan." A short woman with a butterfly hairpin stepped out from behind the silent Tomioka, and Nezuko wanted to imagine it, but her intuition was warning her of the way the man's mood had significantly plummeted at her entrance. "Kachu," Tomioka sighed. "You're under arrest, along with this guy, if that's what you were wondering about," the woman, Kachu, informed her brightly.